On a beautiful sunny day, a young lady with a happy smile was cleaning the zoo. She was glad of this opportunity, and at the same time, she understood that today was her day. Some time ago, her partner, apologizing, asked her to take over for him as he had urgent business. She usually didn't like being assigned other work, but today she was glad of the opportunity as she adored predators. All the predators were aloof and had an incredible attraction, and their grace simply drove her crazy. She believed that they were the most ideal creatures that were created by nature. She literally serenaded them simply for the opportunity to clean up their waste products. She was thrilled to become a zookeeper, however, as she was thrilled just to think about working and being around predators. Despite everything, she knew that this was a very dangerous job. And after some time, all her joy from work disappeared, as a predator pounced on her when she least expected it. After some time, she opened her eyes and noticed that she found herself in a forest. At that very moment, she tried to get up, but heard only the flapping of wings and froze in bewilderment. She didn't know if she was dreaming or if it was reincarnation or a curse, but she didn't understand why she turned into a crow. She was shocked and wondered if such a thing was possible. The lady understood that not everyone was destined to be reborn as a heroine, but she did not understand why she was reborn as an animal. At the same time, she regretted that she had not been reborn as a predatory animal. She understood that her current life was not to be envied. She couldn't believe that one fine day she woke up and realized that she had become a crow. She didn't know what to do now and how to live, and at the same time, she wondered if there would be any meaning in her bird life. At that moment, she wondered what her diet was, as she knew that crows ate beetles, insects, and carrion. She really wanted to see the deity who was in charge of distributing souls, because she wanted to talk to him. She knew she could eat nuts and fruits, but she couldn't see anything around her. After a moment, she decided to fly and look around to find something to eat. The flight gave her a feeling of absolute freedom, and when she thought that it wasn't so bad to be a bird. But after a few minutes, she heard something in the distance. As she flew closer, she realized that someone was talking to each other, and at that very moment, she assumed that there were people nearby. But at that very moment, all her joy from the fact that people were next to her evaporated. But after a moment, she realized that instead of getting food herself, she could simply find a person who would support her. She had, of course, the possibility that some would brush her aside, just as crows were considered birds that carried misfortune. But she had no intention of giving up, as she wanted to fool people. After a few minutes, she finally flew up to the place. But at that very moment, she was taken aback, because what she saw were not people at all. At the same moment, she sighed heavily, as she realized that in this world, there was no place for empty hopes and dreams. She was shocked and did not understand why such creatures existed in this world. She looked at the creatures in confusion, and at that very moment, she was sure of one thing. She realized that she wasn't even on Earth, but was reborn in some fantasy world. But the problem was that orcs are a popular race, and so she didn't know exactly where she was in the game or in the novel, but the upside was that she picked up the language of other creatures. After a few moments, she left them, however, because she knew there was a man nearby. She wanted to find people and warn them about the danger or help them with something. After a few minutes of flight, she finally saw a person. She flew closer to him as she saw that he was not in the best condition. The young man swore, as he could not even imagine that he would be in such a state. He understood that he should not have accepted the invitation to go hunting with the Count. He suggested that Llewellyn was most likely involved in this incident. If he had awakened the divine power of the imperial family within himself, then this whole situation could have been easily resolved. At that very moment, the young man sighed heavily and wondered if this was the end for him. At the same time, the sweet crow looked at the young man with bewilderment and surprise, as she was sure that she had seen him somewhere. At that very moment, the young man turned around because he heard some sound. He looked into the distance in surprise and noticed a crow staring at him. He was puzzled because she looked at him with an angry look. He knew that crows were scavengers. They usually hover over a battlefield or cemetery. Such birds were a symbol of death, and everyone knew this. He wondered if she had been waiting for him to die so she could feast on him. He understood that at any moment the orcs could come out and attack him, so he wanted to sit quietly. But at that very moment, the crow made a sound. He reached out to her with fury, because he knew that if she did not shut up, death awaited him. At that very moment, he looked into the distance in surprise as she fluttered upward. She flew away from him and continued to croak. A few minutes later, the orcs noticed the crow, and they assumed that it had found their man. Meanwhile, the young man looked at the crow with bewilderment. He hid and heard the orcs leaving. He wondered in bewilderment whether the crow had not wanted to taste his flesh. As she flew away, she turned around because she saw that the orcs were following her. But at that very moment, she thought about the young man. She was sure she had seen him somewhere before, but unfortunately, she didn't remember whether he was from the novel or the game. She understood that she had to remember what world she was in, but she understood that even if she didn't remember, she would save the young man's life. She looked away shyly as she realized that it was not only his good looks that helped him. The lady understood that he was her only clue, and she could not let him die. A moment later, she fluttered up into the sky, as it was assumed that they were already far away. But they moved away, but at the same time she led the orcs to the cliff. She flew away, but they continued to shout after her because she had deceived them. After some time, she flew to the place where the young man was, but she saw only traces of blood. At that moment, she looked into the distance and realized where he was headed. But at the same time, she realized that she needed to look for herbs that could help him with the bleeding. She didn't understand herbs, but thanks to the bird's inner sense, she could understand something. At that very moment, she sighed heavily because she realized that she had to look for something useful and later think about what would be useful to him. Meanwhile, the young man sighed heavily. Sitting by the stream, he washed away all traces so that the orcs would not smell him. At that very moment, he realized that everything had turned out much better, because if the crow had not led the orcs away, death would have awaited him. He could have died if he had fought them in such a state, but the bird, symbolizing death, saved him. The young man sighed heavily as he realized that this was ironic. But at the same time, he understood that luck would not accompany him forever. But a moment later, he was taken aback as something fell on his head. He looked at the herb in bewilderment as he realized that it was used for bleeding. The young man simply could not believe it. And at that very moment, he looked up. He froze in surprise when he saw a beautiful crow who greeted him with a smile. He stood there for a moment, staring at her, unable to believe his eyes. He wondered if a bird could be so smart, but at that very moment he assumed that she was someone's familiar, or some kind of hybrid. But after a moment, he suggested that she might be a polymorph dragon. He sighed heavily, as he realized that all options were quite probable, but those who supported him did not have a familiarity. Hybrids didn't like people, and dragons wouldn't interfere in other people's affairs. He didn't understand why the crow was helping him. A moment later, the young man froze in surprise as the crow presented him with fresh fruit. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted him to eat the fruit. At that very moment, the crow began to spit with a satisfied look. As he lifted her up, he sighed heavily, and she only beamed with joy as he understood her speech. He began to eat and tasted the sweetness of the fruit. It was so sweet that he realized that he would never forget the taste of the fruit, or this day. This is how their cohabitation began. She found fruits or healing flowers, and sometimes she warned him about dangers. At the same time, the young man caught fish and rabbits, cooked them, and shared them with his companion. She was glad because she didn't have to eat nasty insects. They helped each other as best they could. And then the young man, smiling, called his pet by a new name. He greeted her with a satisfied smile every time she returned to him. At first, he cast suspicious glances at her, but now his eyes were filled with warmth. And at the same time, some unfamiliar feeling began to arise in her heart. She understood that people experienced something similar when an idol called them by name. Reincarnated was speechless when she looked at him, but she understood that for such sinful beauty, people should have been put in prison. Reincarnated looked at her companion in surprise as he stroked her tenderly. At the same time, she understood that she should not give in to provocation, but unfortunately, she was melting before our eyes. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she liked being his pet. The young man knew that up until this moment, everyone around him had only tried to deceive or betray him. He felt an inexplicable, pleasant feeling as a creature appeared, next to which he felt a surge of strength. Just now, he was ready to live with her his whole life and not give a damn about the imperial palace. But at the same time, he understood that he did not need to do something like that. He knew that many knights had died for him, and he was well aware that the people would suffer because of his brother's tyranny. The young man understood that he needed to return to the palace as soon as possible. He knew that if he returned in this state, he would fall into a trap again. He was aware of the fact that he needed to awaken his powers in order to gain power. Evidence that he was a descendant of the imperial family, the imperial power, which included the ability to transform into a wolf. After some time, Raynell flew over the forest in search of herbs. But after a few minutes of flight, something unexpected caught her attention. She looked into the distance in surprise and noticed something shining in the grass. She was surprised because she noticed the precious stone in the grass, but she understood that she could be mistaken, since the stone was far away. She understood that there could not be any jewels in the middle of the forest, and since she was in a black suit, the stone had no value for her. She wanted to fly further in search of herbs, but at that very moment, something pulled her to the ground. She was taken aback as she realized that her fellows really liked such shiny ones, and at that very moment, her instinct kicked in. Raynell quickly rushed down towards the unknown stone. Sometimes, when she did such stupid things out of instinct, she felt a fierce Spanish shame, but she understood that she was human. A moment later, she looked at the stone in bewilderment, as it seemed familiar to her. After a few minutes of thought, she remembered where she had seen it. She knew that it was not a gem, but a fruit called Rock. It contained a power that could awaken a character's inner strength. This fruit can only be obtained once, and the ending of the game will change depending on who gets the fruit. Moreover, if you give the fruit to the weakest character, he will die, unable to resist the poison of the fruit. And because of this, you can go to prison. It was practically random every time, so she often wanted to throw the phone across the room while playing the game. While playing this game, she still successfully completed one character's route, but at the same time, she completely forgot about the game she had given herself to, since she had played it 3 years ago. She was shocked and didn't understand how the creator could send her to a game whose name she didn't even remember. The only plus was that she finally remembered the man she had been close to lately, Kamut Ebel de Wulfric. One of the characters available to choose from is Crown Prince Wulfric of the Empire. Now he was being pursued and wounded, and she came into the world when he had not yet received the right to inherit the throne. She also knew that he had not yet obtained the power of the imperial family. At that very moment, she realized that she was destined to awaken his powers. But to do this, she needed to bring him the fruit. She assumed that perhaps when he had power, she would be able to find a way to return to her world. However, when she brought him the fruit, he was very surprised. Kamut was shocked, as he realized that this fruit was rarely available even to members of the imperial family. He assumed that she was a dragon or a seer, but he understood that if he ate him, his fate would change. He understood that he would either become stronger, and all obstacles would seem like mere trifles to him, or he would die, unable to cope with the power of the fruit. But the young man was aware of the fact that he simply had no choice. At that very moment, he sighed heavily, looking up, and a moment later, he called his pet. Kamut looked at his pet with a smile and declared that if he died, she should live a happy life for him. At that very moment, he began to consume the fruit. A few seconds later, she saw a bright light. Kamut was then absorbed by the light after eating the fruit. She looked at the prince in surprise, as it was truly an incredible sight. She knew that in the game, he was on the verge of awakening his powers. And by giving him the fruit, you could enjoy the wonderful scene of the release of pheromones, during which he became very sexy. She knew that this scene was worth it for Togo to give him the fruit, but she also knew that she gave him the fruit so that his business would improve, and not so that Togo could see such a spectacle. The young man was a little excited at this, as he felt a strange sensation, as if power was overflowing him. The rest of the forest's inhabitants fled when they sensed the energy, as it seemed dangerous to them. Watching this spectacle, she became distracted and turned around, as she felt some tension. Raynell stood frozen in shock as the prince's power brought the uninvited guests to them. She was shocked because she knew they should have come after he woke up. She didn't understand why they came at such an inopportune moment. At that very moment, she remembered how he had said with a smile that if he died, she should live a happy life for him. Raynell was puzzled and knew that she would not see a happy life since she was about to make the stupidest mistake in the world. At that very moment, she rose up and began calling all the uninvited guests. Bursting into bitter tears, she realized that she just needed to hold on until the moment the prince woke up. Meanwhile, the young man was burning in agony and rage as he felt a burning pain. He was in so much pain that he wanted to die, but he knew that he had to endure it because he understood that he had to survive in order for it not to happen. He remembered the knights who had protected him until the end of their lives. They shouted at him that he must survive no matter what. But they wanted him to prove that their deaths were not in vain. Kamut was furious because he knew he couldn't just die. When God created this world, the sacred animals that served him were sent to the lands he created. Wolves were the only ones who could imbue beings created in God's image with their strength, so that they, the people in whose veins the blood of God flowed, could wisely rule their people. After some time, he nevertheless changed his appearance to a sacred one. Raynell turned around as she heard a crash, but at the same moment she saw that the prince had turned. She was glad that he had finally come to his senses. But at that very moment, she realized that she could no longer protect him. Now, she could afford to rest a little. So at that very moment, she fell, but the prince managed to catch her. Kamut looked at the crow with puzzlement as he asked her not to wait for him and to live happily. He understood that it was foolish for such an intelligent creature to remain on his side, and if she had left him, she would not have had to suffer. Kamut, in turn, was very tired of the feeling of helplessness. Looking into the distance, he sighed heavily and told his friend that she would soon recover. After some time, she opened her eyes and felt a burning pain. It was so painful that she couldn't even open her eyes normally. But after a few minutes, she felt a flow of magic. And at that very moment, she sat up, because she did not understand what they were doing to her. Rainele started screaming because she didn't know who the person was next to her was, but she was calling for the prince. A moment later, the prince calmed his girlfriend and declared that everything would be fine with her now. Kamut told his friend that they were now in the residence of his faithful knight, and he also reported that the priest had cured her. She was taken aback and came to her senses as she realized that her body did not hurt at all. She was surprised because she realized that she had been healed with magic. A moment later, the priest bowed to the prince and announced that it was time for him to leave. For a while, the prince stared after him, but after a few moments, he realized that they were alone. He sighed heavily and hugged her tightly because he was afraid that he could lose her. He hugged her tightly and said that she could not even imagine how much he was afraid of losing her. At the same time, Raynell was very confused and shocked by his words, as it seemed to her that her heart would fly out of her chest. She was shocked, as she had never even held hands with anyone before, and she had no immunity to such rejection of the prince. She didn't understand why he hugged her like that, because she was in the body of a crow. But now she understood why such men were not available to women, since all the handsome men were stolen by birds. At the same time, Raynell understood that he would soon marry another and leave her, but in turn, she did not want to think about it. At that very moment, she began to scream, and the prince was taken aback, as he assumed that he had hugged her too tightly. In her soul, she screamed as if she was upset that she was not made the main character, but at the same time, the prince asked her for forgiveness because he did not want to hurt her. The prince looked at her with a smile and declared that he was glad about her recovery and therefore had miscalculated his strength. At the same time, he spoke with joy that he survived thanks to her, because she constantly helped him, and in the end, with her help, he was able to awaken. He was grateful to her, but he regretted that she had suffered because of him, and therefore he did not know if he would ever be able to repay her for something like that. But the prince understood that no matter what happened, he would always be by her side. Raynell, in turn, looked at the prince with confusion, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. At that very moment, she flew closer to him, because she understood that his very existence was a crime in itself. She knew that the girls of this world should keep their hands to themselves, because she didn't want to give him to anyone. She understood that if he did find someone, she would peck at her until the girl ran away herself. Galenos entered the prince's room and greeted the prince. He looked at the prince with joy and said that he was very glad that everything was well with him. At the same time, the prince asked for forgiveness for suddenly appearing to his knight. Galenos del Winster was a knight and a loyal subject of the prince, but the young lady did not know what kind of character he had. The young man bowed and told the prince that he should not worry about such things, as it was the duty of every knight to help the heir. He knelt before the prince and declared that he was a sinner who had not taken care of the prince in times of danger, and therefore he wanted to atone for his guilt by giving his life. They froze in shock as they did not expect anything like this. Raynell, in turn, was shocked by everything that was happening, since she understood that the handsome man could not die without her permission. At that very moment, the prince knocked the sword out of the hands of his subordinate. Kamut looked menacingly at the knight and declared that loyalty was good, but he wanted to avoid extremes. The lady was overjoyed because she understood that the prince also did not want the handsome men to die in vain. The knight was shocked and called for the prince as he realized that he had made a mistake. Kemet told the knight that he did not blame him because he could not be near him because he was on a mission assigned by the emperor. The prince looked at the knight with a smile, as he was already glad that he had not gone over to his brother's side. Kamut smiled and told his comrade that if he still felt guilty, he should promise him something. The prince declared that he wanted the young man to become his sword and protect him. At that very moment, the knight took up his trusty sword and swore an oath of allegiance to the prince. Raynell looked closely at the young man as she remembered something important about him. She knew that in the game, the knight was the prince's loyal knight. The prince asked with a smile whether Galanos would really serve him even if he failed to awaken the power of the imperial family. At that very moment, the knight said that it was exactly so. The prince looked at his friend with a satisfied smile and thanked him for his faithful service. She knew that the knight's loyalty remained unwavering until the very end. But at the same time, she was surprised and did not understand why the prince did not tell the knight that he had already awakened the power. After some time, they were sitting at the table and having a casual conversation. At the same time, the knight told the prince that he knew about his injury. The prince said that everything was exactly so, but at the same moment, he called his faithful friend. Galenos looked at the crow in surprise. But at that very moment, he remembered that she had previously sat casually on the prince's shoulder. He didn't understand why the prince was with such a creepy bird nearby. He brought it, smiled, and said that he understood perfectly well what he was thinking. He said with a smile that it was she who distracted the orcs that were chasing him and found healing herbs to stop the bleeding. And she was his savior. He stated that if it weren't for her, he would have already died. At the same time, the knight looked at the crow with distrust. He knew that the prince was always the perfect, outstanding person, and at the same time, he always took care of his subordinates and never showed his weakness. If he made even the slightest mistake, his life would be in danger due to the already awakened third prince. He simply could not believe that the prince, whom he knew from such a side, was smiling so warmly at the death bird. He realized at that very moment that the prince was made of different stuff. Even I, a simple crow, was able to recognize this. Galenos knew that he was the prince's personal knight, and he couldn't just give in to her. She looked at the knight with bewilderment, because she did not understand why his eyes were burning so terribly, but she understood that prejudices would not disappear in one day. Kamut, looking at the knight, said that he had several questions for him, and first he wanted to know what was happening in the imperial palace. He wanted to know the situation after his disappearance, and the prince assumed that he had been declared missing. The young man said that, although the knight's bodies were found, there were no traces of the prince nearby. The prince understood that after this, search parties had to be formed, and all of them were the third prince's people. At the same time, Llewellyn said with a haughty grin that he could not sit and do nothing when his older brother was missing. Kamut, for his part, was not surprised by this, but he understood that his brother could learn to play to the crowd a little better. At the same time, the prince understood that his father needed an heir to the throne, and it did not matter who it would be. Reincarnated listened to their conversation, but at the same time, she understood that it was creepy. She understood that this was the war for the throne. Be that as it may, allowing one's own sons to fight for the throne, putting their lives on the line, is too cruel. She understood that her friend had been through a lot throughout his life. The prince looked at his friend in surprise, as he did not expect this. At that moment, he asked if she was trying to console him. He looked at her with a smile and said that everything was fine. She didn't need to worry, because now he was ready for anything. At that very moment, the prince asked his knight to go to the capital and inform his father that he was alive. Galenos understood that in this case, the third prince would take another step. Kamut knew that this would happen, but it would not happen soon. Kamut understood that since his brother had told the emperor that he was worried about him, he would have to pretend to be a caring brother for a while and hold off on his intrigues. Kamut looked into the distance with a grin, because he understood that even if his brother tried to attack him, he would be able to fight him off. After some time, Raynell watched all the preparations closely. Raynell was glad, because she understood that they would finally go to the palace. Raynell couldn't believe she was going to the imperial palace, which she had only seen on the screen. However, she knew she had to keep her ears open, because that was where her friend's enemies lived. Now, she is even glad that she was not reborn as a human, because then she would have become his weakness, and no one would have liked the fact that he brought a stranger with him. And then her girlfriend, whom the prince brought, could easily be used as a hostage. So for now, it's much safer to remain the prince's creepy pet. After some time, all her thoughts disappeared as the prince came to her and announced that it was time for them to leave. At that very moment, he asked her for forgiveness. She looked at him in bewilderment. She didn't understand what was going on at all, since he had put her in a cage. The prince sighed heavily and said that she would have to be patient for a little while until they reached the capital. At that very moment, she screamed because she knew that he was a traitor who had put her in a cage. When she worked as a zookeeper, she often had to transport animals in cages, and every time it was like a fight to the death. And so she herself found herself in the place of the poor animal, and she screamed at him to let her out, because if he did not do so, she would be angry with him. The young man was taken aback and asked the prince for permission to carry his pet, but the prince declared that he could manage on his own. At the same time, Raynell was shocked by everything that was happening, and it seemed to her that everything was going dark before her eyes. She screamed and demanded that he let her out. After some time, the prince looked at his girlfriend in bewilderment and asked if everything was all right with her. He asked for forgiveness, as he did not know that it would be so hard for her. But in response, he heard only a drawn-out groan. After a few seconds, she came to her senses and looked at him with fury. Without wasting a single minute, she pounced on him and bit his hand, mooky as she did not understand how he had the audacity to ask such a thing. She continued to scream at him, and at the same time, she bit the prince. He sighed heavily as he realized that she was really very angry. At that very moment, he tenderly patted her on the back and declared that it was all over. She understood that she would not give in to him even if he stroked her, but a moment later she realized that she had no pride at all, since she had succumbed to his charms. Kamut sighed heavily and asked his friend for forgiveness for making her suffer so much. He said he had to take her with him, and he didn't want to leave her alone. He said that now it didn't matter at all who she really was, a hybrid or a dragon, since he was glad that he met her on his way. At that very moment, the prince kissed her tenderly and asked her never to leave him. The young lady was shocked by everything that was happening, as she did not expect him to kiss her. At one time, she was in a stupor from shock, while the prince said that he had many enemies in the palace. He constantly had to doubt people and think about who he could trust and who he couldn't. But the only one he could trust was his faithful friend, Raynell. Looking at the prince, she realized that this was his moment of weakness. He shared with her thoughts that he could not share with anyone. She realized that this was the reason he was telling everything to the bird that could only hear him. Raynell knew perfectly well that if she were human, he would not have shown her such a side of himself. At that very moment, she flew right up to him. She knew that even if she couldn't help him because she was just a crow, she intended to always stay by his side. He looked at her with a smile and thanked her for her understanding, but she was puzzled as her whole face was burning with embarrassment. After some time, they finally arrived at the imperial palace, and she looked at the beautiful view with admiration. A moment later, she also saw her friend's room and was delighted by the sight. Raynell saw a lot of shiny ones and realized that no one would know if she stole one. A moment later, she was taken aback and came to her senses, as she had almost given in to her crow instincts. At that very moment, he moved his gaze intently, looked at her, and declared that he would leave her for a short while, as he had urgent business to attend to. He said that she just needed to sit quietly until he returned. Otherwise, she might get into trouble. She agreed with the prince, and a moment later, he asked the servant to take care of the crow. Kamut looked menacingly at the young man and declared that he must communicate with her carefully, and if he disobeyed the order, he would face death. The young man burst into bitter tears after the prince left, as he already wanted to go home as soon as possible. At the same time, he simply could not believe that he had to take care of the bird of death, but he understood that he could not disobey the order. A moment later, he approached the bird because he wanted to feed it. At that very moment, Raynell saw the beautiful worms, who were looking at her with joy. She was in shock, and she simply had no words, only emotions. The young man declared that birds loved worms, so she should like something like that. But at that very moment, she could not bear it and screamed. The prince was taken aback and froze in place, as he thought he heard his girlfriend's voice. He was already starting to worry and wondered if it was in vain that he left her the worms. He really wanted to finish all the work as soon as possible and return to her. But a moment later, his brother appeared in his path, asking him with a predatory grin if he was okay. Kamut looked menacingly at his brother and greeted him. Llewellyn grabbed his brother by the hand and said that he was very worried because he had not awakened his powers and was in danger. Kamut saw that his brother had not changed, so he had no intention of falling for his provocation. Kamut smiled and apologized to his brother, saying that he should play along with him, but he was afraid that this time his brother had gone too far. The young man immediately froze in place from surprise and rage. Kamut saw that his brother was shocked by the small riposte. Third Prince Llewellyn received all the support for only one reason. He had already awakened his power long ago. Having tasted influence and authority, he made no effort to develop himself or strengthen his position, so he grew up arrogant and rather stupid. Kamut. Looking at his brother, he did not feel his aura, although he also awakened, and that is why he still has not become a full-fledged heir. Kamut said that in the future, he would try to play along with his next prank better. He also thanked his brother for sending a search party. Kamut asked his brother for forgiveness for the fact that they had to work in vain. The prince, surprised, said that he did not understand what they were talking about. Kamut understood perfectly well that until now, he had not been able to fight back properly due to the lack of support. As he passed his brother, he stated that he had to meet his father, and for this reason, they would talk next time. A few minutes later, the prince entered my room to see his father and greeted him. The emperor sighed heavily and told his son that he had heard the news of his disappearance, but he was glad that everything had worked out. Kamut asked his father how his health was, sighed heavily, and stated that his condition had not changed and he was not getting better. At that very moment, Emperor Seth looked at his son with a satisfied smile as he realized that he had come out of his shell. The emperor declared that this was precisely what the man who had stabbed him in the back had feared, and he was now talking about his brother. The prince said with a smile that he was grateful to his brother because, thanks to him, he was able to awaken. The emperor sighed heavily and declared that the young people were simply fools. Kamut smiled and told his father that even illness had not managed to dull his sense of humor. Kamut told his father that he would strengthen his position, and then the emperor could relax and meet with his mother, whom he missed so much. Kamut looked at his father with a grin and asked him to remain the same as he was before until one of them won. The emperor cursed, but at the same moment, the young man told his father with a smile that he sometimes forgot that he had always been impudent. Kamut stated that if his mother had not died of illness, the inheritance matter could have been resolved more simply and in a less cruel manner. At that very moment, the emperor laughed. He understood that everything was correct and that he should have such ambitions. The emperor, in turn, wondered what expression his beloved would have if she saw him now. A wolf chooses a mate for life, and if he loses his partner under unforeseen circumstances, he will suffer pain, and in the end, he will die and follow his partner. At the same time, the emperor very much hoped that the day would soon come when his son would take his place. He hoped that his meaningless life, supported only by a sense of duty, would finally end, because he already missed the smile of his beloved. Meanwhile, Raynell, sitting in the cage, sighed heavily, as she wanted to eat very much. She didn't know how long the prince had been gone, but she knew that birds had fast digestion, so she felt hungry, as if she hadn't eaten for several days. She saw terrible service, because she was offered nothing but worms, and the young man did not understand what was wrong with her. She cried and wanted the prince to return to her as soon as possible, but after a moment she finally looked at the delicious bowl of worms. She wondered if she should try one, to quench her thirst with another, so to speak. On an empty stomach, this plan seemed plausible to her. She understood what was now in the bird's body, even though its mind was human. But a moment later, she received a sobering chepalak of humanity. She was in shock, because she almost gave herself up, being blinded by hunger. Raynell knew that if the prince didn't return soon, she would truly be a train worm. After some time, the prince returned to her and asked in surprise whether she had really not eaten at all this time. She screamed, and the prince, in turn, screamed at his subordinate because he allowed this to happen. After some time, she was already eating a variety of delicious foods to her heart's content. The prince looked at her with a smile and asked if she would like to join him since she had eaten her fill. He smiled and said that he would like to give her something. Since they had arrived at the palace, he opened a whole box of valuables in front of her and said that she could play with them as much as she wanted. She was shocked and didn't know how much something like this cost. Especially, she didn't understand why he gave her something like this, because she was wearing black and wasn't even very pretty. But now she understood that he really loved her. But she also knew that it would be wonderful if this love was like that of people. Raynell sighed heavily as she realized that in this world, they would clearly not make a girl out of her, and it was time for her to give up. The prince asked her with a smile if she liked the gift, and she was glad that at least he didn't consider her a harbinger of death. She knew she needed to pull herself together and move towards her goal step by step, so she tossed him one of the stones she had given him. He beamed with happiness and asked if she had really given him a gift. At that very moment, the prince hugged his girlfriend tightly, as he did not understand how she, a bird, could be so cute. After some time, Raynell happily stretched her wings after a short period of confinement. It wasn't that she hated the prince's room, it was just that there was nothing interesting there. But she still needed fresh air. But a moment later, the man was taken aback, as he saw a crow flying above him. He knew that this was unheard of, because the bird of death could not fly in the prince's garden. So he wanted to take a broom and catch up with it. But at that very moment, the prince declared to the man that from now on, no one could drive the crow out of the garden. The prince stated that he valued her, and the man would be personally responsible to him if she got hurt on his watch. The man was taken aback and said that he would never remember such a thing. He quickly ran away, not understanding the tastes of aristocrats. The prince sighed heavily, as he understood that in a little while she could get hurt. He didn't know how much he needed to warn people. Kamut understood perfectly well that he needed to make some kind of sign so that people would not treat his pet badly. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she felt someone approaching. The young man came closer to his brother and with a grin said that he had been looking for him for a long time. Llewellyn, looking at his brother, stated that he was neither in the room nor in the office, and therefore he assumed that his brother had disappeared again. Raynell looked at the prince with contempt and indignation. Kamut, looking at his brother, said that it seemed like he had a lot of free time since he went and looked for him. Llewellyn said with a smile to his older brother that he had come to visit him since the older one had lost interest in the younger one. Raynell looked at her brothers with bewilderment, as even she could sense their sparks of hatred. She saw that the atmosphere was very eerie, and wondered if everything would be okay. The prince told his brother that he had come because he had heard some very interesting news. Llewellyn looked menacingly at his brother and said that he had heard his brother asking his father to leave the throne to him. He looked at the prince with fury and asked if he was serious about this matter. Kamut said with a smile that he was quite serious, since this issue should be resolved soon anyway. He knew perfectly well that one of them would become the next emperor. But, unfortunately, someone will be destined to die at the hands of another. Llewellyn looked at his brother with a fierce grin, as he would never have thought that he could hear such a thing from him. He shouted at his brother that he hadn't even awakened his powers, yet he was already making such statements. Kamut smiled and said that his brother was a fool for thinking that power alone would be enough to become the crown prince. The young people were talking to each other, and the lady was watching them closely as she was witnessing a battle for the throne, something she could only see in dramas. Kamut came closer to his brother and declared that he himself was an idiot, because he awakened his abilities, but did not use them when he had the opportunity. Llewellyn looked at his brother with fury and shouted that they would resolve the issue of the right to the throne here and now. At that very moment, he transformed. Kamut looked closely at his brother's wedding, as everything was happening as he had expected. But a moment later, he was taken aback as he saw his brother, who was in the form of a wolf. Kamut mocked his brother, saying that he looked more like a dog than a wolf. Such words deeply hurt his prince, and at that very moment, he attacked his brother. Without wasting a minute, he opened his mouth as if he intended to bite his brother. Kamut was puzzled and did not know how to parry the blow. But at that very moment, to his surprise, his girlfriend dealt his brother a strong blow. Kamut, in turn, froze in shock and stupefaction, as he did not expect to see anything like this. At this, his girlfriend struck a very strong blow, and his brother fell to the ground with a crash. Raynell was furious and did not understand how the prince dared to attack her. She screamed with fury and struck him with equal fury, blow after blow, demanding that he attack her. Kamut looked at his younger brother with indignation, as he had been beaten by a crow. But in turn, he understood that if this situation was left unresolved, his girlfriend would be in danger. At the same time, he saw his brother's gaze, full of rage, which was directed at his girlfriend. At that very moment, Llewellyn pounced on the crow. Canute, in turn, had no intention of watching his friend suffer, so he immediately rushed to his brother and dealt him a very strong blow. From this blow, the young man was transformed back into a human. Canute looked at his brother with fury as he came to him without permission, transformed and attacked his pet. Canute angrily told his brother that there was no wild dog blood in his veins. He did not understand why he had the feeling that there was something like that in his veins. Llewellyn shouted furiously at his brother and called him inferior, and he was angry at him because he dared to hurt his face. Canute came closer to his brother and declared that his words were true, since he was an incomplete member of the imperial family, which he had failed to awaken. But at that very moment, he mockingly told his brother that he was still stupid, since he had forgotten one thing. He wasn't going to give in to his brother's strength just because he hadn't awakened. He said with a grin that he was increasingly thinking that it wasn't that difficult. The young man immediately stood up and declared that next time, everything would be different. Canute understood that now that he had awakened to his powers, everything was different. But he knew that he had to act. He knew that if he gained the right to the throne when his brother had more followers, there would be disorder, and he did not need that. He wanted to strengthen his power first. At that very moment, he caught his girlfriend and declared that she would get a scolding, while she was shocked and did not understand why, since his brother started it first. After some time, the prince scolded his friend that she had acted wrongly, and that such actions of hers were dangerous. He knew that no matter how immature his brother looked, he was in an awakened form, and yet he was much stronger than an ordinary person. The prince was worried that his marriage could harm her, but he saw his girlfriend repenting. A few seconds later, his evil image was destroyed by her sweetness. But in turn, the prince understood that this was not right. Canute stated to his friend that he was immune to cute faces, so she shouldn't try anything like that. He looked at her menacingly and asked what would happen if she were hurt or killed. She sighed, knowing she had nothing to say to him. She didn't know if she did it because of her knowledge of animals from her past life, or because of her confidence in the reflexes of a crow's body. Indeed, the prince, who was unaware of her true identity, was of course worried about her, and she seemed reckless to him. Reincarnated knew perfectly well that if she were in his place, she would be angry too. At that very moment, she came closer to him and croaked and asked for forgiveness, as she did not want to make him worry anymore. He sighed heavily and wondered if he had been worrying for nothing. He assumed that she could be a hybrid or a dragon, and then she would easily tame the attack of the inexperienced prince. However, if you remember the injuries she received earlier, it is obvious that she could not use her abilities at the moment. Therefore, he needed to protect her until he was sure that she could stand up for herself. He said with a smile that she didn't need to rush and protect him, putting her life on the line because he had awakened and become stronger. He said with a smile that he didn't want to lose her to someone like his brother. Meanwhile, the young prince was furiously destroying everything in the room. He did not understand how his brother dared to treat him like that. He was very angry and wanted to crush his brother as soon as the opportunity arose. At that very moment, he remembered with rage the crow with which I had attacked him. He was furious because the damned bird dared to touch his face with its dirty paws. At the same time, the young prince wanted to ascend the throne as soon as possible, and first of all, destroy all the crows in the empire. However, something seemed very strange to him. He couldn't understand why his brother suddenly came to the defense of some crow. After all, he had previously simply ignored his bullying of birds and animals. At that very moment, he thought to himself with a predatory grin that he needed to find out about this bird as soon as possible. Without wasting a minute, he approached the mirror and declared that this was the order of the future emperor. Therefore, he wanted the man to create for him what he needed at the moment. At that very moment, he received an approving response from his comrade. The man looked intently at the young prince and declared that he would soon do everything for him. Sometime later, Reincarnated was sitting in the office with the prince, and the prince was working on his documents. As she fell asleep and drooled, she kept telling him that he needed to rest a little. A moment later, the prince was informed that the marquis had come to see him. Reincarnated was taken aback and came to her senses as she had heard a similar name somewhere, entered the prince's office with a smile, and declared that he had come because the thing the prince had asked for was already ready. Marquis Namuel said with a smile that he did not think he would tear the prince away from his work. The prince looked intently at the marquis and asked him to pass. And he also said that he had done it faster than he had expected. Raynell, in turn, without wasting a minute, flew up to the marquis. At the same time, the young man froze in place from shock. She looked at him with confusion and intentness, because she simply could not believe that she saw someone like him with her own eyes. Charmant Namuel the Elder, the Duke's son and also a brilliant magician. He was the main character of the game, who had a main branch. She couldn't even believe that she would meet him in real life. At the same time, she understood that he was drawn to be beautiful, but in life, he was even more beautiful. She happily hugged and caressed him, and Mark noticed that the prize had a very active companion, and for the first time in his life, he had seen such a friendly crow. The prince, in turn, froze in shock and stupefaction, since he did not expect that his girlfriend would behave so kindly towards raw materials, then towards strangers. He couldn't believe what he saw, as she had never been so clingy to other people before. Kamut quickly approached them and looked menacingly at his friend, and also demanded that she go to the sky and stop bothering the guest. She was taken aback because she was blinded by someone else's beauty and forgot about her own handsome man. At that very moment, she asked for forgiveness, since she had no intention of cheating on him. Kamut covered her beak with his hand and declared that it seemed he had to scold her again. The Marquis looked at the crow with a smile and declared that the prince had a truly interesting bird. He knew that ravens were very intelligent, but he had never seen them listen to a human like that, so he assumed that she was a hybrid or a dragon. He said that he would take her to the laboratory and that was good and proper. But at that very moment, the prince took her from him and said that he would at least like to just see that thing. At the same moment, the Marquis presented a beautiful necklace to the prince. The Marquis said that he did not know to whom the prince wanted to give such a gift. But in turn, the Marquis noticed that the man to whom the gift would be intended was very valuable to the prince. Raynell looked at the prince with bewilderment and wondered who the person was who had such an important principle. She wondered if he was really going to leave her and marry someone else. Raynelli was taken aback by the realization that she would soon be alone. At that very moment, he declared that he would not leave her. She reached out to him because he expressed tenderness, that she was his everything. He smiled and declared that she would be their child, but at that very moment, she shouted that she didn't want that. She understood that this was not the best option, and if something like this happened, then it would be better for her to die, because love is not an affordable luxury in the body of a crow. But the young lady also knew that she could not do anything about it, and she would have to become the prince's child. But moments later, she was taken aback as he put a necklace on her. Raynell, in turn, burst into tears of happiness as she realized that this necklace was meant for her. For a while, she screamed and rejoiced as she could not believe that the prince had prepared something like this for her. She saw that the necklace was too big for her, but she knew it didn't matter because it was meant for her. The Marquis, with a surprised smile, asked the prince if this necklace was really intended for the crow. The prince declared that everything was true, and this was a sign that she was very valuable to him. Kamut looked intently at the Marquis and declared that for this reason, he should curb his irrepressible curiosity towards her. The Marquis said with a smile that he would do something similar. Since he did not want the prince to hate him, the prince asked how he could be of use to the Marquis. The Marquis looked at the prince with a smile and asked if he would not become their emperor in the future. He told the prince that if he fell into the hands of such a person, his position would not be enviable. Kamut looked at the young man with a grin as he was saying dangerous words here. The prince wanted to know what his purpose was, and the Marquis said with a smile that his father had always said that it was better not to interfere in politics. The Marquis said that his father, an unawakened member of the imperial family, had renounced his right to the throne. He stated that he also did not want to get involved with hypocritical aristocrats, so he chose the path of a magician. But unfortunately, he could no longer just sit and do nothing, because for Llewellyn, magi were nothing more than tools, and he didn't even see them as people. He understood that if such a man became the next emperor, the country in which he was born and raised would collapse right before his eyes. Looking at the prince, he said, "That's why he wasn't going to just watch something like that." The prince looked closely at the Marquis and asked if he was sure that he would not be the kind of ruler who would lead the empire to collapse. He stated that power had changed many people. Raynell, in turn, knew that the prince said such things on purpose. She wondered if the prince had any doubts about the Marquis, but the Marquis, with a smile, told the prince that he felt that he was not that kind of person. At that very moment, the Marquis told the prince that if he found it difficult to believe his words, then he could accept the gift. The young lady was taken aback and looked at the Marquis in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he had Rock. The Marquis told the prince that this item would help awaken the hidden power in whoever ate it. She was shocked, wondering if the prince had awakened after eating the Rock that the Marquis had brought him. She was puzzled and did not understand what was going on with the one she had found in the forest. The Marquis told the prince that this fruit was extremely rare and could not be found in a certain place or season, so everything depended on human luck. She was in shock because she knew it was the end, and she changed the original plot. The prince asked the Marquis why he didn't eat it himself. The Marquis said that he would have awakened the power of the wolf within himself, but he wanted to follow the path of a magician and not fight for the throne. The prince said with a smile that he was raising his position, but he also saw that the young man's intentions were pure. The Marquis asked if this meant that they were now allies. Kamut stated that they could make a treaty, and if he ascended the throne, he would repay him for what he had done for him. The Marquis bowed at that very moment and declared that if the prince became emperor, all his knowledge and magic would belong entirely to him. The Marquis also stated that the prince should not be so polite to him, even though he was part of the imperial family, but the future emperor did not need to speak so respectfully to a simple aristocrat. The prince, in turn, looked at his companion with a smile and agreed with him. After some time, he looked closely at this fruit and wondered to whom he could give it. He understood that it had to be a person who would not betray him, even if he gained great power. No one else came to his mind except his girlfriend. He wondered what would happen if she was a crow, which was supposedly a hybrid or dragon Congress fetus. At this point, the young lady felt cold, and then she didn't know what to do with this gift. No matter how much she thought, she couldn't even imagine what consequences could result from the fact that the prince, who had already awakened, would have another fruit. The more she looked at him, the more obsessed she felt. At that very moment, she could not stand it and took the fruit from the prince. The prince was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. He was scared and screamed that if she ate him, she might die. He wanted her to put him down immediately, but she did not listen to him and continued to hold him in her beak as if enchanted. After a moment, she swallowed it. The prince was shocked, and at the same time, he opened her beak to get the fruit. He understood that if the awakening began, she would not cope. He couldn't just watch helplessly as she died. At the same time, the prince understood that if something like this happened, he would not be able to bear the losses. He looked at her for a moment in silent anticipation, but a moment later she only released acrid steam from her beak. He looked at her with bewilderment as she looked at him, as he hoped that nothing would happen. Kamut sighed heavily, as he was glad that she was okay, although he said that he really didn't know what would happen to her. At that very moment, he looked at her pleadingly and asked her not to eat anything suspicious next time. After she felt a strange obsession, she did not remember anything, as if someone had erased her memory, but, according to him, she ate him. She knew they had lost a valuable fruit, but at that moment she looked at herself and realized she was okay. Raynell was a little upset, as she had assumed that she could become a tough crow, and thus be able to deal with all of her friend's enemies. She sighed heavily, as she realized that nothing had happened, and she was destined to live the life of a bird. Raynell knew that if she had been in agony like her friend when she woke up, there would have been some hope for a brighter future. At that very moment she was taken aback, as her whole body suddenly began to ache, and the prince was seriously frightened by her appearance. She thought for a moment and wondered if she could really wake up to us, but she saw that her body did not glow like the prince's, but at the same time, she felt very tired. The prince, in turn, screamed with tears in his eyes and begged his girlfriend to come to her senses. After some time, the young priestess told the prince that the crow had no bodily injuries. He was in shock. He didn't understand why she suffered so much. She said that she didn't know why, but no healing prayers worked on the bird. She said it was strange because if there was a problem in the case, she could have healed the bird. Even though Raynell's temperature was rising at an incredible rate, there was no internal or external damage. At that very moment, the prince angrily asked the priestess to leave the room. He was furious because he knew that everything happened because of him. Kamut understood perfectly well that everything would have been fine if he had not been so careless. But he knew that all he could do at the moment was watch her suffer. Kamut, in turn, felt wild fear and powerlessness, and at the same time, he hated this. He sighed heavily and asked his girlfriend to wake up. Kamut said that no matter how many problems she brought him in the future, he would forgive her everything. Meanwhile, the young lady found herself in some kind of spatial dimension. At the same time, she did not understand where she was. But a moment later, she saw hands instead of wings. She was taken aback because she understood that she could not die so easily, because she still had a lot of business with the prince. But after a few minutes, she felt a strong wind. Long ago, a black bird that flew close to the sun helped the wolf by becoming his wings and eyes in the sky. The blackbird, to whom the wolf shared his power, was supposed to cleanse the earth of corpses for the sake of people, so that the decaying remains would not make the living suffer, bringing new kinds of illnesses to the world. The bird gave life to crows, scattering the eggshells across the ground, so that one day her children could eat them and be even closer to the sun. After some time, the prince came to his senses, but he realized that he had fallen asleep next to his girlfriend. At that very moment, he froze in place when he saw a girl on the bed instead of his girlfriend. He looked in bewilderment at the beautiful young lady who was sleeping peacefully in a warm bed. At that very moment, he sat up and looked at her in surprise. He stared at her for a moment, wondering if she was a hired killer. But at that very moment, he realized that his judgments were wrong, since she had gentle hands and she could not sleep peacefully next to her victim. For a while, he looked at the girl in confusion as he saw a familiar necklace on her neck. Kamut always wondered with skill whether it was really Raynell in front of him. A few minutes later, the prince touched her hair. It felt like he was touching feathers. He could not take his gaze off the young lady, for at that very moment, he realized that it was his friend in front of him. He realized that because of the fruit, she had turned into a human. A moment later, the young lady woke up, and in a calm manner, she asked why she had been woken up, while the prince, in turn, was a little puzzled. She sighed heavily and said that it was not time to eat yet. But at that very moment, she was taken aback, because she saw hands instead of wings. She was in shock and did not understand what had happened at all. Without wasting a minute, she shouted that she needed a mirror because she wanted to see herself in a new look. He caught her easily, but she continued to scream, and the prince calmly said that she was going in the wrong direction. At that very moment, he led her to the mirror and looked at her with a tender smile. Raynell looked at her reflection in surprise, as she didn't expect to see something like this. She saw that her appearance had changed very much, and she was different from her past self. The young lady wondered if this was because she had swallowed the fruit. She was well aware of the fact that something had changed so much. Raynell was a little puzzled because she knew that she was too weak for an awakened body. She understood that since God made her human, he could give her muscles like in her past life. At that very moment, she sighed heavily and came to herself. She understood that she needed to think carefully about everything because she had become human again. Raynell was happy because she knew she wouldn't have to sit in a cage anymore, and she also didn't have to eat worms anymore. At that moment, she threw all her thoughts away and looked intently at the prince. She was surprised because he greeted her with a gentle smile. He smiled and asked if she had admired herself. Raynell didn't answer his question, but she knew that all this time there were many things she wanted to do but couldn't, and it was hellish torment. And now she could hug him as much as her soul desired. So without wasting a minute, she threw herself into his arms. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect this. She was glad, as now they could talk. She burst into tears, because she was glad that she could call him by name. After a few minutes, Yuna calmed down, and the prince asked if everything was okay with her. She sighed heavily and said that she was fine. He smiled and asked why she was crying if everything was fine. He wanted to know if she was so afraid of him that she turned into a human. But the young lady assured him that this was not so. She didn't know how to explain something like this to him, and she didn't know if he would take her word for it. She knew that if she told him her story, he would find out that he was a character in a game. And all the misfortunes that fell on his head were specially invented at the whim of one person. She understood that she simply could not tell him such a thing. At that moment, she sighed heavily and stated that she realized that she almost died because of the Kroban rock. And that is why she became scared. The prince looked at her intently but said nothing. But a moment later, he declared that he felt the same way. She looked at him in surprise, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. He said he was worried that she wouldn't wake up, and it felt like his world had collapsed and everything went dark before his eyes. Kamut was ready to take all her pain on himself, but still, he was glad that she woke up. And now he saw that she was sitting in front of him. Kamut hugged his girlfriend tightly and said that she simply couldn't imagine how happy he was right now. He hugged her tenderly and said words of gratitude, Nahmul, because he was glad that she did not leave him. The young lady froze in shock and was filled with embarrassment. She didn't know what to do. Even when she was in the black, his murderous tenderness made her squeal. She didn't understand what he was doing now because she was no longer a bird, and he couldn't treat her the same way before. Raynell was blinded by his radiant smile, but at the same time, she realized that she had been crying for a long time, and now she did not look her best. Kamut asked in surprise if something was wrong. He wanted to know if she was uncomfortable hugging in that position. She was shocked because he treated her like an animal, but she was already human. She knew that at this rate, her heart would simply explode. Raynell knew perfectly well that it would be better if she returned to the crow's body and calmed down a little. But after a few minutes, everything happened as she wanted. Raynell, in turn, was shocked by what happened and did not understand how this could have happened. She did not understand why she returned to the body of a bird again, as she wanted to regain human form. She screamed and demanded that her human body be returned to her, while the prince wanted her to come to her senses. He stated that she was probably shocked by the repeated transformation. He understood that she was not yet accustomed to this, and a little practice would resolve the issue. He said with a smile that everything was fine, and that he would now show her how to make something like that. He asked her to look at him more closely and try to repeat all his actions. At that very moment, he turned into a beautiful wolf. She looked at him with admiration and embarrassment, as she was thrilled at the sight of predators. She knew she should have instinctively cowered in fear at the sight of such a large wolf, but she was only blinded by his grace and beauty. At that very moment, he licked her beak, and she froze in a daze from such a thing. Raynell was embarrassed by what he had done, but he just looked at her with a smile because he thought she was cute. A moment later, he transformed back into a human and said with a smile that it was easy. But she looked at him intently, as she was forced to disagree with him. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked if such a demonstration was not enough. Then he said that she would succeed if she concentrated and thought about who she wanted to transform into. Raynell looked at him sullenly, because she knew that something like this would not happen, since in her past life, she wanted to win the lottery, but nothing happened to her. But moments later, her young lady did transform into a human, and the young people looked at each other in surprise. She said with a smile that she had succeeded, and the prince supported her, as he claimed that something like this was easy to do. After some time, the young lady enjoyed a wonderful meal, as she had not eaten normal human food for a long time. Kamut looked at his friend with a smile and asked her to eat more slowly. He noticed that she used the cutlery well. He wondered if she had been watching the people eating. At that very moment, she was taken aback, as she realized that she had made a huge mistake. At the same time, she could not reveal her secret to him. Then she said with a smile that she had admired him while eating. Kamut said that he just asked because he was interested. Then she said that she was already full. He asked if she could transform herself so that he could call the servants. She agreed with him, and at that very moment began the transformation. A few seconds later, the young lady also transformed into a crow. She was happy because she realized that she had now become a master of transformation. She understood that now nothing was impossible for her. At the same time, she wondered if this was the reason the prince wanted to hide the fact that she was human. She understood that this was right, because he had to have one ace up his sleeve. A moment later, she transformed again, and he asked her for forgiveness. She was surprised and did not understand what he was talking about. Kamut said that because of his egoism, he forced her to hide her human form. But this was a special reason. At that very moment, he said that he would like to ask her for something. She was taken aback and wondered if he really wanted her to become a spy. Or maybe he wanted her to kill his brother, disguised as a servant. She understood that no matter what he asked, she had to try. But since she was not yet ready to kill people, she wanted to become a spy. At that very moment, the prince looked at her and declared that he would like to ask her to take care of his safety. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Raynell looked at the prince with bewilderment for a moment, wondering if he really didn't intend to use her new ability. The prince sighed heavily and said that his brother was arrogant and greedy, and if he liked something, he would want to possess it. The prince hated it when he had to say things like that, but it was dangerous to be human in the imperial palace. Raynell sighed heavily because she wanted to not understand his mental anguish and live a safe bird life. At that very moment, the prince came closer to his friend and tenderly asked her to wait a little. He smiled and said that he would soon create a place where it would not matter what she looked like. He forgave her to give him a little time. Raynell looked away from the prince as she was very confused by his words and actions. At that moment, she said that she understood everything. Raynell looked at the prince with a gentle smile and asked if she could help him somehow so that he would change to this place a little faster. He was surprised by her words, but at that moment he hugged her tightly and agreed with her. Meanwhile, with the help of a magic ball, the young man watched them. He looked at the magic balls with mockery as he learned their little secret. Meanwhile, the man, sitting in his office, wondered where he had gone wrong. He understood that his plan was perfect, and the prince simply should not have survived in such conditions. The prince's faithful knight was sent on a mission, and all those accompanying the prince were killed. At the same time, the prince was seriously wounded, and the man thought that the end would soon come for him. But surprisingly, the young prince survived. Moreover, he declared his intentions to become crown prince to the emperor himself, and now everything has become even more confusing. The man sighed heavily and wondered if his decision had been wrong. He knew that the aristocrats supported the third prince, who was ill-suited to be the emperor, simply because he had awakened. Beastman also said the same. A powerful representative and mercenary of the tiger people declared that they would not bare their teeth while the wolf ruled the lands of the empire or the people. He was an authoritative figure, and so the man supported the prince, who awakened his powers. Marquise Wilhelm believed that he should support him because he wanted the empire to prosper. But he didn't know what would happen to him now because the first prince survived, and the third prince simply abandoned him. Marquise Wilhelm was given up on the task, as he realized that this was a complete end and failure for him. He knew that he must now decide to live the life of a recluse, not knowing when death would overtake him, or he could try to find another way. After some time, the Marquis visited the prince, but to his surprise, he saw a terrible raven on his way. He was perplexed by the sight of the crow, as he knew that this bird was a harbinger of death. He did not understand why the prince was so calm, and why the bird was on his shoulder. The prince asked the Marquis why he wanted to see him. Canute looked at the Marquis with distrust, as he was curious why his brother's right hand was seeking a meeting with him. Canute asked the Marquis if his conscience had really put him in this situation, and he decided to apologize for that vile attack, while the young lady looked at the Marquis with fury. The Marquis stood frozen in stupor, and at the same time he felt a surge of fear. He knew it would be absurd to expect the prince to carry on carefree conversations with someone who had tried to kill him, but he thought the death bird was a hint. He understood that as soon as he started talking nonsense, his head would fly off his shoulders. But he understood that he had to behave calmly, since he had gone far enough. The Marquis stated that he did not regret what he had done, and did not come to apologize, because he believed that this was the only solution to help the third prince fulfill his duties. Canute told the Marquis that he believed that only the awakened one would ascend the throne, and therefore swore allegiance to the third prince. However, he returned alive and well. The prince came closer to the Marquis and declared that now, having no other choice, he had come to him. The Marquis was taken aback by such pressure. He looked intently at the prince, for he saw that he saw right through him, and that he possessed all the qualities of a future emperor. At this, the Marquis, without wasting a single minute, bowed his head before the prince. Canute sighed heavily and asked the Marquis if he realized how pathetic he looked now. The man stated that he had nothing to say in his defense, and that he had made the wrong decision and was now obliged to pay for the legal action. The Marquis declared that he would accept any punishment from the prince. Canute, looking at the Marquis, declared that he was well aware of his abilities, but of course he could not trust him. Canute told the Marquis that not only now, but also in the future, he would more than once face mistrust and contempt because of the one who had come to him today. The prince asked the Marquis if he could endure something like this, and whether he would be a rat on a sinking ship. The Marquis declared that if the ship sank, he would go down with it. After some time, the young lady transformed and asked the prince in surprise why he spared the Marquis since he tried to kill him. The prince said that such things are difficult to explain, and it is something like a profitable investment in their happy future. He knew that the aristocrats on his brother's side would be greatly shocked by this, and that there would be more of those who wanted to follow him. He was, of course, very angry with him. But unfortunately, the prince could not afford to suffer losses due to impulses and emotions. At that very moment, he tenderly kissed a strand of her hair and declared that thanks to the Marquis, he met her. She looked away from him in embarrassment and asked him not to do something like that. But the prince only looked at her with a smile and asked if he could ask her a question too. The prince asked why she helped him at their first meeting, because he knew that he should have been indifferent to her. She was in shock and did not know how to answer his question. At that very moment, she realized that she had to answer him. She remembered the real reason she was able to find him in the first place. Reynel looked at her companion with a tender smile and declared that his golden hair had shone beautifully in the sun back then. For this reason, she helped him, and she didn't even think that he would decide that she was a hybrid or a dragon. The prince looked at her with a smile. He came closer to her and declared that, since she liked his hair, from now on he would take better care of it. He touched her tenderly and declared that he was ready to do something similar so that she would continue to love him. At that very moment, she was taken aback and filled with embarrassment. The prince, in turn, only watched her and quietly chuckled. And the young lady was puzzled and did not understand what these sudden outbursts of tenderness were coming from him. She understood perfectly well that the reason was not so important, and now the only thing that mattered was that he had become a very important person for her. So she had to find a way to help him while staying at a distance. Reynel knew perfectly well that he would become an emperor in the future, on which the well-being and fate of the entire nation will depend. The ominous bird of death will only contribute to the acquisition of a bad reputation. After some time, the prince sighed heavily and menacingly and announced to his knight that he had a problem. The young man was surprised because he did not expect the prince to have problems. The prince did not know what to do, and he couldn't even formulate his problem. Galenos asked what was bothering the prince. He said that the prince had recently increased the number of his comrades. Because the Marquis had gone over to their side, the palace was thrown into chaos. But the third prince was completely unaware, and he didn't even know that the Marquis was an important figure in his faction. But now he will understand something similar, because many aristocrats who supported neutrality began to secretly go over to the side of the first prince. Galenos looked at the prince with bewilderment, because he knew that everything was not going well. He did not understand why the prince was so worried. At that very moment, he sighed heavily, because he realized that the prince was really having a hard time. He asked the prince to tell him everything. Galenos shouted that he was his faithful sword and was ready to risk his life to solve this problem. At that very moment, the prince looked menacingly into the distance and declared that his girlfriend no longer wanted to be with him. Galenos looked at the prince in bewilderment, and he only said that he was talking about his crow, which always followed him wherever he went. But earlier she asked for forgiveness, said that she had a headache and wanted to sit in the room, but he did not know what to do, and he wondered if he had upset her in some way. At the same time, the knight was furious and realized that the crow was involved in this situation. He was very angry, because he knew that it was not enough for her to capture the prince's attention, but she still dared to make him worry about such things. He was furious because he knew she had made the fragile prince think about her. Galenos knew full well that he had to save the prince when he was attacked, so that he would not be so dependent on the death bird. To his regret, he realized that he was too late. But he knew that since everything had happened this way, he had to do everything possible to make the prince forget about the raven. Galenos didn't think he was a good advisor, since he didn't understand the feelings of animals. But he told the prince that he needed people loyal to him to fill the void in his heart. He shouted to the prince that he was his faithful knight and devoted man, and if he wanted, he would tear out his heart and give it to him. The prince sighed and asked his faithful knight to forget about such things and just leave. After some time, the young lady sat quietly on the closet and watched the maids who were cleaning the prince's room. She saw that they were trying very hard. Reynel knew it would be nice if she could do something, since she had no entertainment. The day Mayor Kiss switched sides to the prince, she decided to keep their distance only for a while, not forever. She knew it was the right decision on her part. She assumed he had a lot of business meetings after that. She knew that all of Koso would look at him if the deathbird was constantly sitting on his shoulder. She saw many people in the imperial palace, and rarely was he delighted with her. She saw looks full of unfounded hostility that she was not given to understand. Although she didn't understand anything about the structure of this world, one thing was clear. Such views would certainly not contribute to Kamut becoming emperor. For this reason, she wanted to simply stay in the room. But at the same time, the young lady understood that she was a person who had worked all her life. Raynell at first thought that she would simply watch the servants. However, she saw that the third prince did not send his lackeys to them. At that very moment, she looked intently and temptingly at all the new decorations in their room, as she wanted to peck, bite, and lick them too. She understood that she could not do anything great because she was limited in her actions. For this reason, she wanted to simply try to get closer to the people she often saw along the way. But at that very moment, the maid screamed and looked at the bird of death with tears in her eyes, since she did not understand why it was approaching her. The maid understood that there were others in the room, but for some reason, the bird was interested in her. But after a few moments, she came to her senses and looked in surprise at the rose that the crow had presented to her. The girl was a little surprised and puzzled, as she could not accept such a luxurious flower. At that very moment, the prince entered the room and, smiling, told the maid that his crow had liked her, and so she could keep the flower for herself. The maid was taken aback, as she knew the value of the flower. The prince, smiling, declared that the girl was worthy of him because she had tried. She was taken aback and immediately declared that she understood everything. At the same time, she knew that she was only fulfilling her duties and could not believe that such a high-ranking person praised her. As she left, she was deep in thought, but at the same time, she was comparing one princess, his raven, and 3 princes. After some time, the prince asked his friend with a smile, did she really not want to be near him because she wanted to play with the maid? Raynell sighed and stated that it wasn't true, and other people didn't like her, and she thought she would push away those who wanted to join him. The prince was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She said with a smile that for this reason, she decided to try to keep her distance. Raynell said he was wary of her at first too. He asked for forgiveness, but she only said that, as was his case with him, she thought that if she put in a little effort, the day would come when other people would treat her well. The prince sighed heavily, as he understood that even knowing that others hated her, she still took steps towards them. Kamut came closer to her and, taking her hand, declared that it didn't matter at all what others thought, because fate itself had brought him together with her. He said that in the suffocating palace, only she was his salvation, and therefore he did not want her to avoid him because of others. He said that he would do anything for her. If she wanted food, he would feed her delicacies from his hands. And if she needs a cozy bed, he will make it with his own hands until she likes it. He asked what she wants right now. At the same time, young Lydia was stunned by his words, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. What she craved wasn't trinkets and food. At that very moment, she asked him if he could find a raven so that she could have a mate. The young lady was taken aback. She did not understand why Veronia's instincts were coming out at such a touching moment. The prince was taken aback and looked at her with bewilderment, as he had not expected such a thing. She burst into bitter tears and screamed that he had misunderstood everything. Kamut looked at his friend with bewilderment and declared that he could not do this. She was taken aback and asked why, her crow instincts kicking in. He knew it was probably just his greed. He knew that she could take human form, but she was born and raised as a raven, so it was only natural that she wanted a raven for his mate. However, he could not allow his precious girlfriend to be with some strange lout. He did not want to give her to anyone. He understood that if she really wanted this, then her companion would have to be the best raven in the empire, and they would have to try hard to find one. Kamut approached her closer and stated that if she really needed a mate, she should just tell him. She froze for a moment as he touched her lip. At that very moment, the prince said with a satisfied smile that Anna was now in human form, so he could be her mate. She looked at him for a while and did not answer. But a moment later, she realized his words and was filled with embarrassment. She was in shock because she understood that the beast inside her was about to go crazy. She couldn't even imagine what she would do next because of her instincts. But he decided to finish her off. So he said something like that. At that very moment, she made a strategic retreat. The prince could not resist and burst into wild laughter. He didn't understand why she was so embarrassed. She was shocked and realized that he looked like a horny teenager. She wasn't ready for such proposals because she was a complete zero in terms of relationships. But at the same time, she was furious, and she understood that he would soon pay for such antics. At that very moment, the prince's expression changed, and he began to think that he really felt free and carefree, only when he was next to her. The struggle for the throne, disagreements between aristocrats, mistrust of others, deeply rooted in him, and even fear of death. It all seemed meaningless when he held her hand and saw such a sincere smile. He touched her hair, which did not remind him of the night sky, and looking into her violet eyes, he felt that death itself had blessed him. That's why he had the courage to do anything. He wanted to be next to her every moment, and with her help, create a happy future. He wanted to change the gloomy reality into a bright future precisely for her sake. At that very moment, the prince looked at his friend with a tender smile, which made me very embarrassed. At the same time, he understood that as soon as all the threats disappeared, he would definitely tell her something. In the end, the young lady was unable to convince the prince and remained with him in the office. She understood perfectly well that she had no choice. Since he wanted to be near her so much, she could afford something. Since the young lady had not been in his office for a long time, she wanted to look around while he was busy with work. After a few minutes of inspection, she froze in bewilderment, looking at all the new objects, as it seemed to her that the office had become brighter. She thought for a moment, as everything seemed very strange to her. Reincarnated understood perfectly well that it was natural that the decor in the prince's bedroom was often changed, but she did not understand why something similar was done in the study. She knew that the prince had been busy lately, so he hadn't bothered with decoration. She assumed he had asked the servants to put them up so she wouldn't be bored, but she had a bad feeling about it. She knew that the knight was standing right in front of the office, so she wanted to transform into a human and ask the prince about everything. After a moment, she nevertheless transformed and quietly stated, "I'll bring it," that she became interested in something. She said that there was a lot of new decor in his office, so she asked if he had ordered the servants to put it up. He looked at her in surprise. A moment later, she transformed again, and the prince declared that he did not remember asking for such a thing. A moment later, the prince came out and called his knight. Galanos asked the prince if he had any errand. The prince looked menacingly at the knight and declared that everything was exactly so. He said that the knight should immediately call the marquis. After some time, the marquis came to the prince and began to thoroughly check all the objects that were in the cabinet using magic. A few minutes later, the marquis announced that a recording sphere was hidden in the data items. The knight asked the marquis in surprise what he was talking about. The marquis said that they could see a magical artifact that recorded what was happening over a certain period of time. This artifact could be disguised as another object. He also noticed that she did not record the sound, but she recorded everything that was happening, and this was enough to find out the opponent's weaknesses. Kamut sighed, as he understood whose handiwork this was. The marquis said that everything was correct, and he thought that this was exactly what the prince had ordered from the magicians. But there was one problem. This sphere could be afforded by any aristocrat, but to create it, magicians of illusion and distortion of perception were used, and such powerful magic is not capable of being detected even by high-level knights. The marquis sighed and stated that there was a high probability that a very powerful magician was involved in this. He said that at the moment, he is much stronger than him. After some time, the young lady looked at Rez's records with her beak open, as there were about 5 of them in the office. She knew that her friend was a prince of the empire, but still did not have full rights to the throne and was therefore in danger. The marquis stated that the remaining items were clean, but he thought it was still worth getting rid of the unnecessary items. He said they shouldn't show that they found the spheres. Marquis said they were safe for now. They talked for a while about the spheres and speculated on what the next step should be. At this point, the prince's faithful knight was burning with anger and fury as he realized that he had failed to protect the prince again. He understood that if he had been a little more attentive, he could have avoided such a trap. Even when entering the prince's office, he did not find a single sphere many times. Therefore, he realized that he was not worthy of being called the prince's right hand. The marquis told the prince that his room should be examined for similar artifacts. Kamut sighed and said that they would do it. But first, they needed to stop Galanos from making a mistake. Eventually, the recording spheres were discovered in the room of the first prince, causing a commotion in the palace. Everyone was detained without exception, as they intended to find out the truth. At the same time, the young lady was puzzled because she understood how everything had turned out. She understood that she should have refused such a thing. Earlier, the prince told the maid that she should take some trinkets to the prince's room but he informed her that some of them were enchanted. But he wanted her to do everything so that she would not be suspected. He looked at her with a smirk and said that if she disobeyed or told anyone about what had happened, her sick brother would find himself in a very awkward position. After some time, he said with a grin that there were a lot of irritating factors now, and it wouldn't hurt for him to have a toy on which he could take out his anger. After some time, the prince told his subordinate that his brother had resorted to threats, and therefore they must provide maximum protection to those who did so out of fear of reprisal. Confused by everything that was happening, but I understood that I had to do something in this situation. At that very moment, he summoned his secret subordinate. The prince told him to keep an eye on the butler to see if he was carrying out his orders properly. The young man agreed with the prince, and at that very moment disappeared into thin air. The young prince was immersed in his thoughts. He knew that all the magical spheres had been found and destroyed. Kamut said that they knew perfectly well who was behind this, and there was no need for an investigation. So he asked the Marquis to simply destroy the spheres. The only problem was that they didn't know the identity of the powerful mage who had joined the third prince. Usually, senior mages hated being pushed around and not getting involved in politics themselves. And now it was clear why he had thrown out such an influential person as Wilhelm with such ease. He wondered why his brother did not kill him, since, through his pretense, he supposedly justly introduced the struggle. Kamut was well aware of the fact that as long as the emperor was alive, his brother would play by the rules of the palace. To his regret, he didn't know how many of his secrets brother had managed to find out, but fortunately, his awakening still remained a secret. But he also understood that the last question was about his girlfriend. After all, she had been in his room for a long time and had taken human form several times. Recently, she began to hide and carefully watch those around her. It turned out that she was shocked by everything that was happening. Kamut looked at his friend and declared that everything was fine now because the spheres had been found and security at the entrance had been strengthened. Kamut said that for some time, his personal faithful knight and his people would guard them, and the servants of the third prince simply would not be able to get to them. For this reason, she could go down to him for a short time. But the young lady only looked at him and turned around at the same moment. He wondered if she needed time to calm down, so he sighed heavily and stated that he understood her. Kamut said that he would wait until she was ready to talk to him. After some time, the young lady fell into sleep, but when she opened her eyes, she looked around in bewilderment, as she did not understand what was happening. She knew she had to transform because her friend said everything was fine, but her body wouldn't obey her. She knew everything was fine when she and the prince checked the room, but she didn't turn into a human because she felt afraid. She wondered if it was the crow's instincts that warned her of danger. At that very moment, she shouted at the crow that if he hit her, she would not be able to do anything. But he kept telling her that it was dangerous outside. She knew it was everywhere, and she was only safe with the prince. The raven asked who could guarantee this. She said that in the future, he would become an emperor. The raven told her that this was the prince's future, not hers. And none of the many endings mentioned the death bird. He repeated that, for this reason, she should not trust anyone. Meanwhile, the prince sat quietly in the room and was all on edge, since she did not want to go down, and she did not even want to eat. He briefly considered that frightened animals wouldn't eat while someone was around, so he assumed she didn't trust him. At that very moment, the prince announced to his friend that he would be leaving for a short while, and that she must definitely eat. She didn't answer him, but after a few minutes, she finally flew up to the food. At that very moment, she felt someone's magic. The man thought for a moment and stated that it was difficult to constantly be in the prince's sight, and he enveloped the bird in his magic. After some time, the young league opened her eyes as she felt a burning pain, but she did not understand where she was. Llewellyn looked at the man with fury and stated that he had asked him to be careful with the bird. He was worried that it might die. The man apologized and stated that she simply resisted too much. At that very moment, he asked the prince whether he should call a priest healer, but the prince declared that there was no need for that. He understood that if they patched her up properly, she would be able to escape. He said with a grin that although it would be beyond his strength, she was already broken. However, he understood that this had its advantages. The young lady looked at him with fury. She didn't understand why he was so happy to show that he was simply a rotten person. Llewellyn, with a smirk, told his subordinate that he was free for now and that he should not appear in his sight, as he did not want anyone to distract him. At that very moment, he grabbed the bird by the wing with a fierce grin and declared that it was time for them to get acquainted because she would become his new pet. She screamed and demanded that he let her go, but the prince said with rage that he wanted to wring her neck because she had scratched his face. Llewellyn said with a grin that if she immediately turned into a human and went over to his side, he would forgive her. Raynell looked at him with disdain as he irritated her, but at the same time she realized that he liked her human form. She was furious because she knew he had been dropped as a child. She continued screaming and hitting him. At that moment, the prince looked at her with fury and growled in response. He pushed her angrily and she fell, hitting the wall. He shouted in anger and asked how she dared to contradict him. At that very moment, he locked her in a cage and declared that before her master was not a mature prince, but their relationship came to an end. He shouted that she was now his property. She was furious because he insulted her friend. At the same time, the young lady smoked herself for being inattentive and watching the people in the prince's room. She knew she couldn't do anything because all the spheres were hidden by magic, and she wouldn't be able to find them even if she looked closely at the entire room. The prince smirked and said that she could not hope for Kamut to save her because a barrier had been erected on the room and only a few people could enter the room. Meanwhile, the Marquis tried to destroy the barrier, but unfortunately, he was unsuccessful. The prince's faithful rider wanted to try to destroy the barrier. He swung his sword with ease, using all his strength, but unfortunately, he didn't succeed. He was puzzled because he saw that his strength was not enough, so he did not know what to do. The prince was furious because he understood that there was only one thing he could do now. Meanwhile, everyone present in the imperial palace was whispering among themselves as they saw that a tense atmosphere was in the air, but they did not know what had happened. They assumed that the third prince had done something wrong, but they knew that they had to remain silent since they had taken an oath during the prince's struggle for the throne. Without wasting a minute, Prince Kamut went to the underground dungeon. Everyone looked at him in surprise, as they did not understand why he came to such a place. Kamut, looking at the maids, said that he knew perfectly well that one of them could enter the third prince's room. They looked at him with fear, because they understood that he had come to punish them. He said that some collaborated with the prince for profit, and some collaborated because he threatened. The young maid understood that her hour of death had come, but at that very moment, the prince declared that it was not their fault. He said that it is difficult for the weak to contradict the strong, which is why they could not support him, who had not yet awakened. Kamut stated that his brother was a man who could easily get rid of even his own faithful right hand, so if he became emperor, it would not guarantee them absolutely anything. The young lady understood that even if she didn't say anything, there was no guarantee that the third prince would save her brother. Kamut declared at that very moment that he would never abandon his people in trouble, so he could swear by everything he had. He begged for help from everyone present, as his brother had stolen something precious. The young lady was taken aback and wondered if the third prince had kidnapped the first prince's crow. She was shocked because the prince was begging for help because of a bird that everyone hated. She understood that she could trust the prince, and besides, the raven gave her a flower. So, at that very moment, the young lady decided everything for herself. Meanwhile, Llewellyn said with a grin that a lot of time had passed and no one had come to save her, so she could calmly transform into a new person. She knew he would most likely just kill her, so she decided that obedience was the way out to avoid further injury. However, she looked at him with fury, as she wanted to beat him up. At the same time, she and her bird personality did not approve of such an emperor. Raynell knew perfectly well that if it weren't for her injuries, she would have already pecked his not very smart face to pieces. At that moment, the prince could not stand it any longer and angrily raised the cage. He shouted that she would decide to transform faster if he broke several of her limbs. But at that very moment, he was taken aback as he heard a crash behind him. He turned around in bewilderment as he did not understand what had happened. At that very moment, the first prince entered his brother's room. Kamut stated that similar ones took longer, but he noted that this time his brother outdid himself. Llewellyn looked at his brother with furious indignation, but he did not understand how he had managed to enter the room. Kamut glared at his brother and stated that he had made him run, but things did not always go according to plan. At that very moment, the young lady came closer to the prince and declared that it was she who opened the door. She said that the prince ordered her to do something, so he allowed her to pass through the barrier. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked who she was, because he didn't even remember what he had for breakfast and didn't understand what they were talking about. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise, as she understood that all this time she had been afraid of the petty man. Galeno sighed heavily and told the maid that she needed to choose the right side from the start. Kamut was surprised, as his brother was not even the man he threatened. Kamut said that if his brother became emperor, the country would definitely come to an end. Llewellyn shouted with fury that he had awakened and was much stronger than his brother. He said mockingly that his brother had brought such a crowd just to save a crow. Llewellyn shouted at his brother that he was a man who always cried and trusted no one. But still, he relied on insignificant subjects. He shouted that it did not matter at all. But the prince declared that for the sake of his friend, he would do even more. Kamut came closer to his brother and declared that the emperor was also an ordinary man. He would not be able to rule the empire alone and needed the help of his loyal comrades. At the same moment, he told his brother that he himself had used someone else's help. Kamut said that a mediocrity like his brother would not be able to create such a barrier on his own, and he would never have ascended the throne on his own. He also said that his brother was not capable of creating a recording sphere on his own and kidnapping his girlfriend. Kamut looked menacingly at his brother and declared that he could do nothing without others. It was only him. The young man was in shock, and at the same time he froze in a daze. At that moment he looked at his brother in confusion, as he did not understand how he could say such a thing. Kamut told his brother that he was so intoxicated by his awakening that he did not even look around. The young man remembered how he joyfully ran to his mother and said that he woke up before his brother. She said with a smile that it was wonderful because she knew it was difficult, and at the same time she was proud of her son. Llewellyn shouted with a smile that he was now the best. At that very moment, the madam said with a smile that he was the best. Mija, so he should try to be friends with his brother. Otherwise, no one would take his side. Llewellyn was shocked and did not understand why he should be friends with such a worthless person, because only he was able to awaken, and he was the strongest and most special. He shouted that for this reason, she should look only at him. Madame was puzzled, as she knew that in this way, he would be alone all his life. Llewellyn could not stand it and shouted at his brother to shut his mouth and not dare to say such a thing. At that very moment, the prince grabbed the bird and declared that they would now see how far his brother could go. He screamed that since the bird was so dear to him, he would tear it to pieces right before his eyes. Llewellyn screamed furiously that they would immediately see if he could continue to look down on him. The prince stood frozen in shock. He knew that the original plan was for Namuel and Galenos to combine their strengths and capture the three princes. They intended to do something similar when Kamut distracted him, so that his awakening would remain a secret. However, he could not allow his words to come true, so at that very moment, the prince transformed. Everyone present froze in shock, as they did not expect to see something like this. Kamut knew perfectly well that such behavior might seem stupid because he knew all the risks. But still, if danger threatened something that the wolf held dear, he would, without hesitation, grab his enemy by the throat. For this reason, Kamut dealt blow after blow with fury to his brother in wolf form. The young prince was shocked and understood that this could not be. He did not understand when his brother managed to wake up, but at the same time he wondered why his brother was so huge. The prince understood that his brother could bite him. At that very moment, the maid, with tears in her eyes, called the prince and declared that the crow was seriously injured. She was sure that it urgently needed treatment. The prince struck his brother at that very moment, and thus he bowed to the ground. He quickly transformed into his human form and approached his girlfriend. He tenderly asked if she would allow him to take her to a healer. Raynell, in turn, with the last of her strength, reached out to him and bowed before him. At that very moment, the young prince hugged his girlfriend tightly and thanked her for her permission. After some time, the young healer used her magic on the bird. She reported that she had done everything possible, but the prince noticed that she had not yet regained consciousness. The healer said that, given the severity of her injuries, she could assume that psychological factors were the cause of this condition. She said that she could heal her with divine power, but she was too sensitive to it, so it was better to let her recover on her own. Galenos looked closely at the prince and asked what he planned to do next. The prince said that he had promised to protect her, and now he must take responsibility for what happened. He said that God himself saw that he did not want this, but his brother forced him to do something like this. The Marquis looked at the prince in surprise and asked if he really wanted to make a statement about himself. At that very moment, the prince was introduced, looked at everyone present, and declared that everything was correct, and he intended to announce Bozkurt. In a strange tradition dating back to the origins of the imperial family, under the emperor's watch, a sacred, bloody battle was fought in which several heirs to the throne fought in wolf form until one of them emerged victorious. It's easy to get seriously injured, and if you're not paying attention, you can even lose your life. But there's no room for the machinations of aristocrats in the arena. In this case, the winner received the right to inherit the throne. Therefore, this battle was used as a last resort, and only when several heirs awakened. After some time, the prince walked slowly through the palace, and he heard the whispers of the aristocrats. After all, everyone was saying that the princes had fought last night, and now the real battle for the throne would begin. They were saying that the first principal had awakened, but they had no evidence of this. They knew that they would believe what had happened if they saw it in person. For this reason, the prince, having reincarnated, walked through the imperial palace. He knew that the way to declare Bozkurt was extremely simple, and all he had to do was turn into a wolf, proving that he had inherited the blood of God, and declare war by growling so that everyone in the imperial palace could hear it. As soon as he roared, a terrible roar swept through the entire imperial palace, and at the same time, he destroyed the walls. And, unfortunately, no one was able to stand on their feet. The Marquis froze in shock. When he fell to the ground with a crash, he did not understand what was happening at all, as he felt a wild pressure. At this, the young prince growled and demanded that the wolf come out, as he had challenged him to fight. A moment later, the emperor in wolf form came up to him. Having transformed into his human form, he sighed heavily as he realized that his son was declaring a fight. He approached his son and declared that he would have to rely only on his own strength, and that he should not expect help from those around him. He sighed heavily, as he knew very well what would happen to the loser in battle. The emperor looked at his son with awe, as he understood his aspirations perfectly well. But since the third prince was seriously injured by someone, he needs some time to recover. At the same time, the prince screamed and demanded that the wizards heal him quickly. He shouted with fury that if they did not heal him, he would tear them to pieces when he recovered on his own. The emperor sighed heavily and told his son that he would set a date for the battle when the third prince had fully recovered. He also said that they both had to be in perfect condition to prevent any dirty rumors from spreading. The emperor looked intently at all those present and declared that from this moment until the winner was determined, any tricks and interference were prohibited. He shouted that all the aristocrats who were under the supervision of the imperial family should not interfere, and if anyone violated the order, they would pay for it with their lives. Meanwhile, the young people looked closely at the prince, as they were very worried about him. Galenos, in turn, froze in stupor, as he understood that he could not help the prince in any way. Meanwhile, the young maid quietly looked after the bird. The prince sighed heavily, and looking at the maid, noted that she was no stranger to caring for the sick. She said with a smile that this was true, because her younger brother was often ill. She smiled, and thanks to the priest that the prince sent to her brother, he had become much better, so she need not worry about him. She smiled and said that she would repay him for this and take care of Raynell. The prince looked at her with a gentle smile and said that it would be wonderful if she came to her senses sooner. Meanwhile, the young lady was in another space. She slowly opened her eyes and at the same moment looked around. At the same time, she was puzzled and did not understand why she was in such a place in such a state. She didn't understand how long she had been unconscious, but she knew one thing. The prince was very worried about her. At that very moment, she shouted to Raven to stop such manipulations and let her out. She was furious and continued to scream, but the Raven declared that she was not allowed to go out. She screamed that if she hadn't been kidnapped, everything would have been fine, and at the same time she demanded that he let her go, but he just remained silent. He sighed heavily and declared that there really was some truth in it. She was in shock and screamed that she was suffering because of him, but the Raven still insisted that she shouldn't wake up now. After all, if she went out now, the prince might even get scared. She looked at him in surprise because she didn't understand what he was talking about. He said she should know that animals instinctively avoid those who look like they're offenders. At that very moment, she realized that there was meaning in his words, because there were times when an animal that had been beaten by a tall man began to be wary of all tall people. But in turn, she insisted that the brothers were completely different, so much so that she did not even understand how they could be brothers. So she said that he should not compare them. Raynal, looking at the raven, said that even if she was afraid of her friend, she would overcome this fear herself. She knew that running away would not solve the problem, so she wanted to go to him as soon as possible. At that moment, Raynal looked menacingly at the raven and declared that last time she listened to him and was captured, so now she wanted to do things her own way. At that very hour, the raven sighed heavily and announced that he had raised her. But also, looking at the young lady, he said that she should not forget that he was a part of her and that his thoughts were her thoughts. After some time, the young lady finally came to her senses and transformed into a human form. She immediately fell into his arms. At that very moment, they fell to the ground with a crash, and the young lady apologized to the prince for making him worry. She hugged him tightly and thanked him for coming for her and saving her. The prince was surprised by such words from his friend, but at that very moment, his face changed, and he thanked her for waking up. The young maid, in turn, froze in shock when she saw something like this. She was shocked and simply could not understand what she saw, while the young people sighed heavily as they realized that they had made a mistake. After a few minutes, she sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness because she had to clean up, but she made a mess. They said that everything was fine and they could not blame her because she was surprised by what happened. She understood that this was so, but she still felt uneasy. She sighed heavily and declared that if she had been able to refuse the prince from the very beginning, then this would not have happened, and the young lady would not have suffered. She said that even if she couldn't do something like that properly, her life was worth nothing. Raynal came closer to the maid and told her not to say such a thing. Raynal looked at the maid with a smile and stated that before she lost consciousness, she clearly heard something. Raynal told the maid with a smile that it was she who let the prince and the marquis into the room. Raynal stated that she was a crow, so she was not familiar with all the intricacies of the class system here. But she thought it took a lot of courage for her to decide to do something like that. Raynal said that if I were to use an animal analogy, it would probably be a rabbit attacking a wolf. She told the maid that if she had not agreed then, the third prince would have used someone else to install the recording spheres. And most likely, if it weren't for her courage, she wouldn't be holding her hand now. Raynal, with a radiant smile, told the maid that she could not even express her favor to her. The maid was taken aback for a moment, looking at the young lady, as she was delighted with everything she had heard. At that very moment, the prince told his friend with a smile that if she wanted, he could appoint the girl as her personal servant. Raynal asked with a smile if that was really possible. He stated that of course it was so, and now that she had been exposed, it would be good if the maid continued to help her. He also noted that his brother would not be able to get to her in this way. At that very moment, the young, icy joy rushed to embrace the maid. Raynal asked the maid to take care of her with a happy smile. She also stated that the girl knew her name, so she wanted to know the maid's name. The maid looked at everyone present with tears in her eyes and said with a smile that her name was Nadia. Nadia, with tears in her eyes, said that she would never forget what the two of them had done for her. She said that even if a knife was put to her throat, and no matter how much they tortured her, she would never betray them. They were taken aback as they realized that this was too much on her part. After some time, the young lady sighed heavily and sat down on the sofa with a joyful smile. At the same time, she noticed that it was difficult for her to calm her maid down. The prince declared that she would be a very devoted servant. The lady raised the question that devotion was good, but she did not understand why Nadia refused to go home. Raynal said that the other servants kept telling her to go home as soon as possible. The prince looked at her with a smile, as if he realized that she was the perfect spy. She smiled and declared that she was his silent bird. In a moment, the prince, with a fierce grin, declared that he would order the butler to cut the salaries of the services. But moments later, he said that he was joking because he saw her reaction. He asked her not to make such an expression on her face as if he had fallen in her eyes. He sighed and declared that he would watch his tongue from now on so as not to blurt out something thoughtless next time. Kamut said that when he announced the duel, he had kept them safe for a while, but even so, they could be overheard. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. A moment later, the prince said that he still hadn't explained to her the essence of everything that was happening. But after the explanation, she froze in shock on the spot, as she realized that he was simply not of this world. She was very scared because she understood that he would fight in the form of a wolf. At the same time, the young lady understood that reality was becoming less and less like the original. He saw that she was very excited, so he asked her to calm down. He came closer to her and declared that she was not at all involved in what had happened, and therefore she should not blame herself, because he had simply brought closer the day that was bound to come anyway, because his brother himself had asked for this. Kamut touched his friend and asked her not to worry, but at that very moment he was taken aback, because he saw that she was trembling violently after he touched her. Kamut said with a smile that she should now worry about herself and not about his bloody fight. She looked away from him with a smile, since she did not understand what he was talking about at all, and told him that everything was fine and he did not need to worry. At that very moment, she understood her crow instinct. She remembered how crows were told that animals instinctively avoid those who are similar to their offenders. She really wasn't consciously avoiding the prince, and at the same time, she didn't understand what she should do. But a moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she saw the prince who had transformed into a wolf. He walked up to her and touched her face tenderly. Moments later, he became human again, and with a heavy sigh, he declared that everything was fine, just like when he was in wolf form. The prince also said that, while she was unconscious, the priest told him about the possible psychological consequences. Kamut stated that the fight was postponed due to his brother's injuries, so he had some free time. At that very moment, he declared that he was currently free, and therefore asked if she would allow him to help her recover from the whole shock. He transformed back into a wolf and told her that she didn't have to fight this alone and that she could just rely on him. The young lady was shocked by his words, but at the same time, she looked at him with tears in her eyes and trembling in her body. At that moment, she could not bear it and declared that she was really very scared. Trembling with fear, she hugged him tightly and buried herself in his fur, repeating that she was very scared. Meanwhile, the young knight, not sparing his opponents, engaged in a serious fight. He recalled asking the Marquis if he knew that the prince had awakened. Galenos looked menacingly at the Marquis and said that he was not very surprised when the prince turned into a wolf. The Marquis said that he had guessed something like this. After all, he personally gave the prince the Kroban rock. Galenos threw his opponent back in fury and shouted at the next one, but he was lost in his thoughts, not understanding why the prince had not told him everything. Meanwhile, the knights whispered, looking at the commander, because they saw that he was very violent, and at the same time they understood that they would not be able to hold out at such a pace for long. Galenos furiously struck blow after blow at his opponent, knowing full well that because of one incident, his prince could trust no one. But he thought that after he had sworn to protect the prince even at the cost of his life, he would open his heart to him. He was furious and wondered if he had still not earned even a shred of the prince's trust. Since childhood, he dreamed of becoming a knight with the shield and sword of the first prince, whom he always admired. But because the prince at some point simply withdrew into himself, it took him a long time to become his faithful knight. After some time, the young man finally decided to come to his master, and he reassured himself as he knew that everything was fine. He assumed that perhaps it was some kind of misunderstanding. He knew that the prince had been very busy lately, and he most likely simply had not had time to inform him of everything that was happening. Galenos understood perfectly well that if the prince did not trust him, he would not have allowed him to be near. A moment later, the young man entered the room and saw the prince in the guise of a wolf with his crow. Galenos looked at the crow with fury as she was again next to the prince. At that very moment, the prince reincarnated and, looking at his knight, said that it seemed that he was very upset about something. The man looked closely at the young man and stated that his skills were several times superior to his peers. For this reason, he asked the knight why he did not become the knight of the third prince and not the first. The man told the young man that he said such words because he valued him very much. Galenos, in turn, thanked his mentor for such offers, but stated that he would never change his mind. He looked at his mentor with a smile and asked him not to try to convince him anymore. After some time, he was burning with anger and fury as he learned that his prince was attacked and no one even lifted a finger to save him. And search parties were not even assembled. The young man was taken aback and asked the knight to calm down. He said that the third prince had said that he would organize a search party himself a little later. Galenos understood perfectly well that the prince would rather send mercenaries than look for his brother. The young man stated that he understood everything, but they said that the first prince would die anyway. He did not understand what the point of empty hopes was. At the same time, he told the knight to just let go of the situation and move on. Galenos was furious and said that his prince would survive and he would find him himself. However, to his regret, he was never able to find the prince. But after some time, the prince returned alive along with the crow. However, all his actions upon his return were nothing more than strange quirks. For a while, there was a dead silence and an awkward atmosphere between them. After a moment, the knight asked the prince if he had really revealed the truth so that he would wake up to save the crow. Galenos S. Gem said that the prince revealed a secret that he kept secret even from him, in which he swore to protect the prince with his life for the sake of saving some crow. And at the same time, the prince challenged his brother to a fight, risking his life. He was furious, not understanding what was so special about the death bird that the prince acted in such a way. The prince, in turn, sighed heavily, not knowing how to answer. A moment later, Kamut looked at his knight and asked him for forgiveness for everything that had happened. He said that he trusted the knight, and the real luck was already that on the side of the insignificant one prince, unable to awaken, there was a faithful knight. He knew that just recently he was attacked and almost killed. For this reason, he could only apologize for his excessive caution. He was truly sorry that his knight had learned of his awakening in this way. The young man was a little touched by the prince's words. At that very moment, the conversation turned to the raven. The prince understood why his knight was asking such questions, because he had never told anyone that the bird was dear to him, and in his eyes, it was just an ordinary pet. Kamut, looking at his knight, said that everything he had done for her seemed reckless. He wanted to tell him about this situation, everything, when he became a little calmer. But now he understood that it would be better if he told his knight about everything in advance. At that moment, he looked at his friend and asked if she would do him a favor. She supported him and moments later transformed into a human. Galenos froze in shock as he looked at the young lady. At that moment, he suggested that she might be a hybrid. But then he threw his thoughts away, since hybrids had bird legs. He did not understand where such an appearance came from. At the same time, he looked with surprise at the young people who were communicating with each other casually. The prince claimed that his girlfriend, a crow who could transform into a human because she ate Krobenrock, had saved him from the clutches of death in the forest, and they had been together ever since. The prince said that revealing the whole truth about his friend was a very serious step for him, and he wanted the knight to protect her. And this could be considered a sign of his complete trust in the knight. At that very moment, he asked his faithful knight what he would say about this. Galenos knew that his master had never shown much interest in women. He was a man with an icy gaze who did not allow anyone to get close to him. But now the young man was surprised, since his master himself asked him to protect the young lady from all adversity. Galenos saw clearly that the prince had shown his immeasurable trust in him, and at that very moment, he felt all his anxiety melt away like snow. Galenos understood that now, like a true knight, he would boldly walk with the prince and protect his friend. But at that very moment, he was taken aback and wondered what the future held for him. Galenos suggested that the young people could get married and then have beautiful children. He imagined teaching them to fight with swords and spending his leisure time with them. At that very moment, he knelt before the prince and declared that he would carry out the order immediately, even at the cost of his own life. The prince was taken aback. He understood that it was very good that his knight had regained his spirit, but he still shouldn't have taken his words so seriously. Galenos did not listen to the prince, because he was glad that he trusted him again and relied on him. He understood that he must show even more loyalty and try to help the prince in all his endeavors. After some time, the young people were sitting in the library and looking for books about the duel, but unfortunately, they could not find anything. They did not understand why there were no articles, because it was a question of succession to the throne. After a few minutes, the Marquis found only one proposal for a duel. Galenos was taken aback, and asked what the Marquis was talking about. He wanted to find out more about the duel. The Marquis said that a book called The History of the Empire and Its Laws contained some information. At that very moment, the Marquis said that Boskert this is a sacred duel of the imperial family to determine the next heir. They were taken aback as that was where the information ended. Galenos could not stand it and drew his sword from its sheath, but the Marquis shouted to the knight that the book was not his enemy and did not need to be chopped down. Galenos, in turn, calmed down. But at the same time, he did not understand at all why there was no information about the important ceremony. He understood that there should have been at least some records, even if this was the strictest taboo. Marquis Wilhelm approached the young men and declared that any records of the duel were forbidden. Even if they searched for the rest of their lives, they would find nothing, so they did not need to waste time. The young people asked him what he was doing in such a place. They said that if he wanted to stop them, he would not succeed, since they would not give up. Marquis Wilhelm declared with a smile that he was on their side, but they still did not trust him, since he was a man who easily changed masters. Marquis Wilhelm said with a smile that this was exactly the kind of speech he expected from them, although such honesty was a very rare and valuable quality. But now it would be good to at least listen to him and then judge. Marquis Wilhelm asked if they knew that the current emperor was the conqueror of Boskert. The young people were very surprised, as they had never heard anything like this before. He said he remembered that day clearly, and perhaps the reason why records of the duel were banned was because too much imperial noble blood was spilled at the time. He knew the battle had been brutal and hideous, and he knew it would be terrifying to turn such a tragedy into a spectacle, much less to record it. Galenos asked the Marquis in surprise why he was telling them about something like this. He wanted to know if the Marquis really wanted to intimidate them. The Marquis sighed and stated that he would not have come all this way for those who would be frightened by it. He said that he simply wanted the prince to win the duel safely. He said that he wanted Togo to become the next emperor, and at the same time, he wanted the prince to shed as little blood as possible. Marquis Wilhelm knew perfectly well that the third prince would try to maintain victory at any cost. He looked closely at the young people and declared that for this reason, it was necessary to prepare for all sorts of evil tricks. However, he could not interfere, since all kinds of intrigues and tricks were forbidden. He wanted to give them one piece of advice. Therefore, he said that when looking for information, they should look not at the records of the imperial family, but at their subordinates. He hoped that their actions would help them get their bearings. As he left, he wished them good luck with a smile. At that very moment, the young people looked at each other, as they understood that they already had some kind of clue. After some time, the young man, with a satisfied smile, challenged his master to a duel, because he knew that the most important thing now was practice, so he wanted to help the prince. The prince sighed heavily, as he knew it was early morning. He also asked the knight if he was allowed to help in such a thing. The young man smiled and stated that there was another way. He said that according to records, their emperor's personal knight fought with the emperor every single day until the emperor fell ill. And this meant that he trained even in the lead-up to the fight. Galeno said with a smile that there was already a precedent, so there would be no problems. And besides, the Marquis, now, relying on the records of past years, decided to watch other magicians so that they did not cheat. At the same time, he went to the magic tower to find out which senior mage was helping the third prince. Kamut looked at his knight in surprise, as he simply could not believe that they had already done so much. He wondered if, even if something like this had happened before, it wouldn't be too dangerous. He was just worried that they wouldn't get into trouble because of him. Reynel immediately declared that sparring was a very good idea. After all, he didn't know what his brother would use, so he had to train as much as possible. Galeno said with a joyful smile, "I will bring it." That even his girlfriend agreed with him. The prince said that this was so, but it seemed to him that they needed to be more careful, since they did not really know anything about his brother's intentions. The young lady immediately declared that no matter how strong the beast was, his death was only a matter of time, because she had seen the death of many wild animals throughout her life. And sometimes they died absurdly because of animals that were much weaker than them. And sometimes they lost their lives in an instant because of a small wound that just wouldn't heal. She knew that nature was often merciless, but if he wanted to survive, sometimes he had to resort to mean and cowardly methods. She hugged him tightly and said that she wanted him to survive at any cost. Raynell leaned against the prince's chest and begged him to just stay alive. He was a little surprised by her words, but he still knew she was right. At that very moment, he called his faithful knight and declared that he must prepare the training ground. Galenos looked at the prince and asked if he was ready for battle. Moments later, the prince announced that they must begin the fight. Galenos constantly felt the uneasiness in his movements. He told the prince that if he did not take control of his emotions, he would not be able to give 100% in battle. He told the prince that he had no idea what he was feeling right now, but he had to put all emotions aside during the fight and focus on the enemy in front of him. The prince knew this very well, but it was still not easy. He was well aware that if he lost to his brother, he would clearly not be satisfied with just his death, so he could not help but worry about everything that was happening. At the same time, the young lady was closely watching the young men who were sparring. She looked at the prince's faithful knight with surprise and admiration because she thought that he was just a problematic secondary character. But on the battlefield, he turned out to be irresistible and quite a hero in the first plan. She understood that it would be very good if she could somehow help the prince. At that very moment, she realized that she was not an aristocrat and was not even a human being. And no matter what kind of crap her brain had come up with, she would not be in conflict with the ban. At that very moment, she decided to simply spy on the third prince. But after a moment, Raynell cast aside such thoughts, as she understood that if she acted in her own way, she might simply find adventures in one place, and thus she would cause a lot of trouble for her comrades. At that very moment, the young lady turned around as she heard a scream nearby. She looked at the birds in bewilderment as they quarreled among themselves, and realized that this was what she needed. At that very moment, she flew up to them and said that they should finish their fight and listen to her. They turned to her and looked menacingly. They did not understand who she was and why she was interfering in their conversation. Raynell was shocked because she saw that they were small, but still scary, but she did not understand how she could convince them. Meanwhile, the prince, sitting in his room, was trembling with fear, as he understood that he had no chance of winning. He clearly remembered his brother's strength and size, so he knew that he would lose to him in the blink of an eye. At the same time, he was furious, since his brother hid his awakening until the last. At that very moment, a man appeared in the prince's room and declared that he did not need to worry too much because he was the future emperor. Llewellyn looked at the wizard with disdain and asked if he really decided to laugh at him. Llewellyn sighed heavily and declared that he simply had no chance. The man said with a grin that they still had time and he would find a way. At that very moment, he approached the young prince and declared that he was the future emperor and would never lose in his duel. He said that the prince would pay for daring to surrender against the future emperor. Nadia looked at the young lady in surprise as she asked her to get some cookies. Raynell Skirt said she needed cookies so that little finger-sized birds could eat him. Nadia said with a smile that she would do anything. At that very moment, Nadia asked the young lady if she really wanted to treat her friends with some delicacies. Raynell sighed heavily and said with a puzzled expression, "That's probably true." After some time, she looked at her new acquaintances and, trembling with fear, asked if they could fulfill her request. At the same time, they asked why they should listen to her, since they knew that she was not an authority at all. At the same time, they looked at each other sullenly because they knew that they could not talk to other birds because only their fellow birds understood them. At that very moment, she was asked if she had really eaten the sacred fruit. Raynell was surprised and didn't know how they figured it out. At that very moment, he declared that they had lived in this world much longer than she had and had seen a lot. Raynell looked at her new friends in surprise. At that very moment, she wondered if there was another raven in the palace that had eaten something similar. She was told that he did not live in the palace, but sometimes came with his human friend. She was shocked because she did not expect to hear anything like that. Raynell suggested that she might have met him. At the same time, she understood that in such a case, she could find out from him what to do in a similar situation. She hoped that there were some hidden abilities that she would discover with his help and then deal with all her opponents. The young lady asked if we could meet him, but was immediately told that most likely not. She was told that no one knew where he lived, and the old man did not like it when people talked about him. They said that if she wanted to meet him, she had to find him herself. Raynell sighed heavily as she realized that this would be very difficult. She knew that when the situation became different, she could slowly begin to search. At that very moment, her new acquaintances looked at her and asked what she wanted to tell them. She was taken aback, as she had completely forgotten why she had come to them. Galenos, in turn, defeated the prince and asked what had distracted him. The prince sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness. But a moment later, he said that he was worried about the fact that his girlfriend had been chatting a lot with other birds lately. Galenos stated that he understood the prince's feelings perfectly, but instead of being jealous, he should focus on the duel. Kamut understood this, but he had never seen his friend talk to other birds for so long. Galenos sighed and said that training was much more important now. But at that very moment, his face changed, and he declared that if this bothered the prince, he would immediately destroy all his rivals. Kamut sighed heavily and asked his faithful friend to calm down, but at the same time, he wondered whether such small birds could really be conversationalists. Galenos looked menacingly at the prince and declared that even if it was a small bird, he should not spare his rivals. So the young knight waited for the order from his master. Raynell, in turn, froze in shock on the spot as she heard the conversation of the young people, but she realized that if she continued to chatter carelessly, there would be bloodshed. After some time, the prince was surprised, but asked his friend if she had really asked other birds to watch his brother. She sighed and stated that it was true, because she herself could not have done something like that. Raynell said that in return, she gave them cookies as a reward. But she noticed that this made things hard at the depot, so she asked the prince to give her a raise. The prince looked at her excitedly and declared that it was wonderful. But at that very moment, he asked her for forgiveness. She looked at him in surprise, because she did not understand why he did not apologize. Some time ago, her new acquaintances asked in surprise if they really had to watch over the third prince instead of her. She was glad that they understood her. At that very moment, her friends agreed, since they didn't like him. They said that he was always throwing stones at them, and because of this, even they, who had little understanding of people, remembered him very well. Raynell was in shock, because she understood that the prince was simply a monster. But at that very moment, she was informed that they would not do this for free. They said that she should prepare the payment. At the same time, the young lady Ballast was shocked by their pressure, but still agreed. The prince looked closely at his girlfriend and stated that he had made her worry. He understood that if it were not for him, her life would be without worries and anxieties, and she would be able to fly freely in the sky. It seemed to him that his very existence made her suffer. He understood that this anxiety always lived in the depths of his heart. All this time, no matter how hard he tried, his life was in danger because he could not wake up. And the people around him died very quickly because of this. Therefore, even after waking up, he could not believe in the reality of his powers because he was always helpless and scared. Trembling with fear, he said that he had always been pathetic. He understood that all this struggle only caused pain to his allies and to his precious consciousness. At the same time, he did not understand what to do next. Kamut continued to confirm that if it were not for him, she would definitely be happy. At that very moment, the young lady grabbed his hand and shouted that this was not so. She screamed that he wasn't pathetic at all, because she just wanted to help him. Raynell looked at the prince and asked how she could stand aside while the one she was so madly dear to was suffering and fighting for his life. She asked him not to say such words again, because the reason why she was still with him and did not want to fly away anywhere was because she was happy next to him. At that very moment, the prince looked at her with a smile and declared that he understood her. At the same time, he said that he would always remember this. He knew that she was his savior, and she was the one who healed his wounded heart. At the same time, the Marquis was in the Tower of the Magicians, but at the same time, he was very puzzled, since he had made a mistake and had achieved nothing. Unfortunately for him, none of the wizards he could ask for help wanted to get involved in politics. It was difficult to even get close to the elders, let alone meet them. He understood that simply assuming that the third prince's assistant was a senior mock was not enough to reveal his identity. At the same time, he was puzzled and wondered who the man really was. The Marquis realized that it would be nice to have at least one small clue. After some time, Raynell met with her little spies. Meanwhile, everyone else quietly watched them from afar. Galeno said with surprise that it was simply brilliant to use birds as spies. Nadia, with her nose in the air, declared with pride that her mistress was simply magnificent. Galeno said with a satisfied smile that everything was correct, and this time, Nadia had chosen the right owner. At that very moment, he declared that he needed to teach her as soon as possible how to be faithful and risk her life for the master. Nadia, with burning eyes, said that she was listening to his instructions and that she was ready to sacrifice her life in order to learn. The prince was taken aback and asked his knight not to involve Nadia in such a thing, since he alone was enough. Galenos was glad, because the prince admitted that he was the one and only. At that very moment, the prince declared that his friend had already finished the conversation. Nadia ran after the prince because she wanted to know everything. The prince looked closely at his friend and asked how everything went. At that very moment, she transformed into a human fighter and stated that she had received very reliable information, and this information would definitely help the prince. The lady was pleased with herself as her plan was perfect, and she received valuable information from her friends from the bird club. The young people looked at her intently, as they wanted to quickly find out about valuable information. Raynell, in turn, began to tell them everything with a joyful smile, but all those present heard only a croak from her lips. They looked at her in bewilderment, as they did not understand anything. Kamut looked at his friend intently and was puzzled, but asked if she could explain in a little more detail. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked if that wasn't enough. She realized they wanted details. At that very moment, she began to tell them everything in detail again. But unfortunately, they only heard her croaking. Kamut was confused and did not know how to tell her that she was Karkala. At that very moment, he asked for forgiveness and said that he did not understand the bird language. Therefore, he asked her if she could translate everything into human language. She was taken aback and wondered if she had really been speaking Crow all this time. At that moment, Raynell turned to her inner raven. He sighed heavily, since she only turned to him when she needed him, but even the raven disliked the third prince, so he wanted to help her. Moments later, Raynell sighed heavily and announced that she would now tell them the information from the birds. Raynell said that the three princes were regularly visited by a man. She reported that, unfortunately, the birds had trouble recognizing faces. There was no description of his appearance for this particular bird, but they did say he had long facial hair. She assumed it was about the beard. According to the birds, something in his voice made them feel uncomfortable. And at the same time, he radiated a very strong and unpleasant energy, and it seemed to them as if he was not of this world. At that very moment, the prince declared that he was not very well versed in magic, but with such a hint, the Marquis would be able to find the man. He sighed heavily and declared that this information would be sufficient. After some time, the prince told the Marquis everything they had learned. He sighed heavily, as he knew someone who could use such power. At that very moment, he told the prince that it could only be one person, namely the elder magician Buphelos. The Marquis said that he had heard rumors that the man was studying the magic of the demon realm. The Marquis understood that if there was such a person on the third prince's side, then they would need to take countermeasures without violating the rules of battle. After all, they did not know what tricks they were going to use during the bloody battle. At that very moment, the Marquis asked the prince where he got such information. He understood that obtaining this information was clearly not easy. Marquis Nemuel asked the prince if he had used the shadow. The prince smiled and stated that he could not use it because of the rules, so he sent it away to do her main job. But this time, another of his informants was working. The prince said with a satisfied smile that he had a very reliable source. Meanwhile, the young lady was screaming and begging for salvation, while declaring to her new companions that she had no more cookies. She screamed at her maid and begged for help. But at the same time, Nadia looked at her mistress with a smile, because she saw that she had many friends. After some time, the young lady and the prince were having a meal, but the atmosphere was not the best. Raynell looked closely at the prince, as she saw that he was worried about something. She sighed heavily as she realized that the atmosphere was different now. But the prince didn't give it away in any way. But to her surprise, she felt some kind of tension in the air. At that very moment, she realized that today was the day Boss Kurt began. The thought that this dinner could be the last for the prince made her feel sick. She understood that soon there would be a battle of wolves, not for life, but for death. She understood that such a battle should not be treated as an ordinary wolf fight. Reincarnated knew that all predators were cautious when it came to their bodies, and if they knew they weren't going to win, they would accept defeat and give in to avoid more serious injuries. Because if the injuries were severe, they wouldn't be able to hunt and would die of hunger. But it is more reasonable to consider this situation as a battle to the death between people in wolf skins. Even if you surrender, the enemy will gnaw until he gets tired of it, or until he is sure that the last drop of blood has left the body. She didn't want his beautiful fur to be marred by scarlet blood. The prince smiled and told her friend that she did not need to worry, as the information she had obtained had helped him take countermeasures. At that very moment, he asked with a smile whether she really wanted to perform a ritual for good luck, since she was so worried. Raynell jumped up from her seat and asked what it was all about. But she also said that she would do anything. He looked at her with a smile and said that everything was simple and she should close her eyes for a while. At that very moment, the young lady did what the prince told her, but she did not understand what he was going to do. She froze as he came closer to her and touched her plump lips. He covered her mouth with his hand and at the same moment kissed her tenderly. She froze in place for a moment in surprise. At that very moment, the prince looked at her with a gentle smile and asked if she would allow him to do something similar after his victory, as expected. Raynell, in turn, froze in place with embarrassment, but at that very moment, she could not bear it and transformed into her crow body. She was shocked and did not understand how he could do this to her, but she understood that it was a blow on his part. He looked at her with a smile, since she was embarrassed, as always. But at the same time, the principal understood that she did not need to worry, since he did everything for her. He knew that he would definitely survive, no matter what. After some time, the emperor announced the beginning of the competition. At the same time, each participant was nervous before the start of the fight. Meanwhile, all those present were whispering among themselves, as they wanted to know who would win. They assumed that the first principal would win, as he had an impressive appearance. But at the same time, they assumed that the third prince had a better chance of success, because he had awakened many years ago. Galenos, in turn, was burning with rage and anger, since he did not like what he heard from outsiders. The Viscount told his friend with a smile that he could remember the faces of those who said such things, and later arrange a good life for them. Nadia said that she understood the feelings of the knight, because she herself would be angry if someone spoke badly about her mistress. Meanwhile, the young lady prayed and hoped that her friend would remain unharmed after the duel. After some time, the emperor gave the signal to begin the duel. The prince slowly walked into the arena, and at that very moment, he heard from the emperor the rules of the duel, because whoever wins will become the next emperor. The emperor also announced that no one has the right to interfere in the competition between the two heirs, and anyone who breaks the rules and accepts someone else's help will be disqualified, and the winner will decide his future fate. The emperor said that if he found out that someone had cheated, the tower elders would conduct an investigation, and thus both heirs will have to come to terms with his decision. He looked intently at his sons, and at that very moment wished them good luck. After a few minutes, the young people took on animal form, and without wasting a minute, they attacked each other. A long time ago, he thought that they would live happily ever after, just like in a fairy tale. But at some point, when his mother began to get sick, life went downhill. Despite the fact that all the priests of the empire were doing their best, his mother still wasn't getting better. And her father was so worried about her that he did not pay any attention to him. Whether this was the reason that the selfish nature that had so suddenly awakened in Llewellyn was only getting worse. The aristocrats took this opportunity to form factions and start a schism. Because of this, the second prince eventually died in an accident. It was said that he lost control of his horse and fell from it, but no one in the imperial capital believed that the incident was an accident. This was a common occurrence in the struggle for power, as there were 4 future heirs, 3 brothers and 1 sister. For this reason, eliminating unnecessary people in advance, thereby proving loyalty to their chosen one, while many aristocrats found this approach to be quite reasonable and practical, their weakened mother was so shocked by the death of the second prince that she passed away as if following him. And the imperial palace began to burst at the seams. And finally, it was in the palace that the completely confused brothers decided to bite each other to death. Thinking about this made him feel bitter. After a few minutes of fighting, Nadia burst into tears as she could no longer watch such things. She said that if she had known that there would be such a long and brutal battle, she would have taken a sedative. The Marquis said that this was a serious battle, and it would not end so easily. Marquis Wilhelm sighed heavily, as he expected the first prince to win quickly. Galeno stated that the third prince was in despair, and the one who found himself in a dead end always developed superhuman strength. At the same time, they did not know what the elder could use to help the prince. At that very moment, An old woman approached them and said with a smile that they had good eyesight. She asked if they could tell her about how things were going on the battlefield. She smiled and said that her eyes were not what they used to be. At the same time, she reported that everyone else had refused her. Galenos immediately stood up and asked the old woman to sit down next to them. Galenos sighed heavily and declared that he would certainly tell her everything, but he was taken aback and did not understand why he had unconsciously switched to formal speech, since he was higher in status than her. But at that very moment, he tensed up, as he felt a powerful energy that emanated from the old woman. And at the same time, it was not typical of an ordinary person. He looked closely at the old woman, as he realized that he needed to keep an eye on her. Galenos looked at the old woman and said that Prince Kamut was currently dominant. She smiled and said that she understood everything. The Marquis sighed heavily, as he realized that he had decided to do something like this again, so he wanted to pretend that he did not understand anything and turn on his acting skills. Then he talked about his assumptions about the fight and asked the youth what they thought about it. Marquis Namuel thought for a moment, as it seemed to him that something was wrong. He understood that no matter how desperate Prince Llewellyn was, it was simply impossible to maintain such superhuman strength for so long. At that very moment, he asked his comrades to take a closer look. He asked them if they thought that the third prince did not feel any pain at all. Raynell stared into the distance, because she understood that everything was exactly like this, and it was very strange. She knew that no matter how strong the animal was, it would reflexively flinch even from the slightest bruise. But now she saw that the third prince not only had no sense of pain, but he didn't even have the instinct of self-preservation. But even this would not end so simply, and she understood it. She saw how the third prince bit her friend every time with rage in his eyes. And then her friend would shudder violently after each bite. She was taken aback for a moment, because she had seen something like this before, and this was not just a reaction to pain. While studying predators in a past life, she learned what to do if an animal escapes. Although it was painful to watch animals suffer, without the proper knowledge, it is impossible to cope with them. Unfortunately, tranquilizer guns were most often used, but sometimes it was still necessary to resort to a stun gun. She realized that her friend's body was shaking as if he was being electrocuted. At that very moment, a shudder ran through her fragile body as she realized what was happening. The old woman looked at the crow with a smile because she realized that there was a much smarter one there. He was undercover for another reason in this fight. He understood that it would be very interesting to watch the small but beautiful bird of death. At that very moment, Llewellyn attacked his brother and dealt him a terrible blow, but the young prince managed to push him away. Llewellyn, in turn, fell to the ground with a crash. A moment later, he finally got to his feet and growled menacingly at his brother. But without wasting a minute, he furiously attacked his brother with his mouth wide open. At that very moment, he growled menacingly and attacked his brother. Kamut Pri looked at his brother as he expected, and he used magic. He saw his brother looking at him with their anger and fury. Kamut. Looking at his brother, he assumed that this magic increased overall characteristics, speed and endurance. She also relieved pain and fear. At the same time, he clearly saw that the most vile thing about this was that he used lightning magic. At the same time, he understood that his brother had no intention of sparing him and wanted to go all the way. Kamut knew perfectly well that his act would be cowardly, but he did not expect his brother to go so far, because he skillfully used invisible magic. Kamut. He didn't think he would die from such magic, but it infuriated him that she allowed his brother to fight him on equal terms. And besides, he didn't know when the demonic power would manifest itself, so he had no choice but to follow his friend's advice. The Marquis had previously said that he could not give him specific advice, but he could tell him what to do against enchanted or demonically corrupted animals. This information had nothing to do with combat, so he could give a brief overview. He said that they don't know what kind of magic their enemy will use, but they need to save their strength until the last minute and force them to use magic. If they start attacking with all their might, then difficulties may arise later due to the enemy's hidden magic. In particular, if the enemy was corrupted by demonic magic, then the prince must be extremely careful and not come into contact with his blood. Otherwise, the prince could become cursed. He told the prince that they must develop a strategy to minimize all contact with blood. The prince did not expect an easy victory, but he felt that the fight would indeed be difficult. The Marquis looked closely at the prince as he followed his advice, but unfortunately, he could not understand what kind of magic the third prince had used. The Marquis knew that his elder had been practicing magic for many years, and he clearly hadn't cast any flashy spell. At the same time, he knew that even if he managed to be discovered through testing, the senior magicians would still take care of it. And no matter how much evidence they provide, it will all be useless. The Marquis understood that the only thing they could do now was to believe in the prince's victory and wait. In the worst case, they could ask the emperor to summon a mage with a higher rank than the elders. They did not know whether Bufalos's help was his own and not his own initiative, or whether it was all a decision of the elders. If the decision is made by the head of the imperial magicians, who is higher in rank than all of them, then perhaps the truth will be revealed. However, he never revealed himself and acted secretly, and since he was not one to easily take sides, the Marquis understood that he had to put his life on the line to turn to him, so a good reason was needed. At that very moment, the young lady could not bear it any longer and began to croak loudly. They looked at her in surprise, but at that very moment, Nadia said that it seemed her mistress wanted to tell him something. She screamed and said that the third prince was giving Kamut an electric shock. He asked in surprise if she was uncomfortable being at this event for so long. She was shocked and wondered if he didn't have some kind of ability to understand animals. At that very moment, she began to gesture that the third prince was using electric magic. She wanted them to stop this kind of violence right now. At that moment, the Marquis was taken aback, as he realized that the crow had noticed something. He thought about it for a moment, as he knew she had always been very smart. Galenos asked Raynell in surprise if she was really saying that they should stop the fight. At that moment, she loudly croaked in agreement. She screamed that if Llewellyn continued to shock him, no matter how strong their friend was, he would simply pass out soon. Galenos didn't understand what she was talking about, but he realized that the third prince was cheating. At that very moment, she nodded in agreement, since he was absolutely right, and she was glad that he at least understood something. Galenos shouted angrily that they couldn't do something like that with their hands, so he wanted to stop the fight right now. Marquis was in shock. He shouted that they were now at a disadvantage. Galenos was furious and shouted that he couldn't just sit and wait. Marquis Wilhelm sighed heavily and asked the young man to calm down. He also asked if he was taking the Deathbird's antics too seriously. Galenos shouted angrily at the Marquis, as he had shown unheard-of insolence, and said that the Marquis could not call his mistress that way. Marquis Wilhelm bent as he showed disrespect to the crow that the prince loved so much. However, this did not mean that they had to stop the fight, since they had no evidence. At that very moment, Nadia, with tears in her eyes, asked her grandmother what she was supposed to do when high-ranking people had different opinions. Madame, with a smile, declared that she should just sit quietly to the side. She looked at Nadia with a smile and said that since everyone was so worried about the prince, they should trust them and just watch everything from the sidelines. For a minute, Nadia asked the old woman where in the palace she worked. Nadia said with bewilderment that she had not seen her before. The old woman quickly diverted the topic. And at that very moment, she asked the girl what was happening in the arena. At that moment, everyone present tensed up as they saw a brutal massacre. They saw that one prince had gained the upper hand over his brother. The Marquis, with a joyful smile, declared that the prince had seen through his opponent's magic, and if this continued, he would be able to win without shedding blood. Marquis Wilhelm said with a smile that there was no need to stop the fight now. The young man stated that no matter how strong the pain relief magic was, if there was no way to breathe, then there would be no way to resist. At that very moment, the young lady breathed a sigh of relief. She was glad that everything had ended well. Llewellyn, in turn, only growled menacingly, lying on the damp ground. But a moment later, he transformed into a human and looked at his opponent with fury. Everyone present was shocked, wondering if he had transformed into a human to surrender. Some time ago, the prince met with his mentor. The old man told the prince that if he could not win with his magic, he had one last option. At that very moment, he looked at the emperor and declared that he would like to report the fraud committed during the sacred battle. He shouted to the emperor that Marquis Namuel had always supported the first prince, and he was a member of the imperial family and a tower mage. He shouted that the Marquis had cast a spell on the prince, helping him win. Raynell looked at the prince in shock, as she understood that he was simply a madman who had stooped to such a level. The prince, with a fierce grin, declared that he would now provide evidence according to the rules. At that very moment, he declared that the elders would quickly present the proof. The prince looked at everyone present with a satisfied grin, as he understood that everything was going perfectly according to his plan. He knew perfectly well that his brother had gotten the better of him at the very end, but it didn't matter now, because he was destined to win this battle anyway. After checking, the elders said that they did not feel any magic, although they knew that the Marquis was outstanding, but not so much as to fool them. The prince understood that this conversation was probably another trick to make the elders' decision seem fair. But he knew perfectly well that right now in front of him was his mentor, who stated that his opinion was a little different from the others. Looking at everyone present, the man stated that some of them must have known that he had studied demon realm magic. He said that it was also known to everyone that he contributed to the suppression of the demons and monsters that appeared from the underworld. And it was thanks to this knowledge that he could confidently say that the first prince awakened with the help of the devil's power and used it even in this battle. Raynell, in turn, was shocked by what she heard. She did not understand what kind of nonsense he was talking about. She understood that there had to be a limit to his brazen lies. She knew that he had gone crazy while studying demon magic. At the same time, she did not understand how he could tell such a lie with such confidence. The man looked closely at everyone present and asked if no one had noticed anything strange. He stated that awakening in the imperial family usually occurs before adulthood, but the first prince awakened later, and neither the size nor the strength of the awakened form was normal. Moreover, some time ago he simply went missing. For this reason, the man thought that the prince had faked an attack on himself and, pretending to have disappeared, had awakened thanks to the help of Marquis Yi's devil magic. Moreover, he was sure that even now the Marquis was helping the prince using dark forces. At that very moment, the Marquis could not stand it and declared that this was not true. He said that when the prince returned alive, he personally gave him the awakening fruit, but there was no talk of any demonic power. Buffellos, with a grin, declared that he had something that was difficult to find even for the emperor. Buffellos told the Marquis that if he wanted to assure them that his words were true, he needed witnesses. At that very moment, everyone began to whisper, since they understood that it was most likely true. The Marquis shouted that he was just lucky and found something like that. But at the same moment, he declared that the gentleman's accusations also had no evidence. Buffellos asked the Marquis if he was now claiming that the elder was lying. He said that he had seen a lot in his time, but this was the highest degree of disrespect for him. The Marquis was taken aback and froze for a moment, as he realized that whatever he said, they would use it against him. Then he decided to take extreme measures, and at that very moment he went downstairs. Galenos, in turn, was taken aback and called the Marquis. Nadia froze in shock. She didn't know what the Marquis was going to do. At that very moment, the Marquis approached the emperor and declared that the prince was innocent. He shouted that he could swear that the prince was innocent of his own life. So he asked to call the head of the imperial magicians so that the whole truth would be revealed. Galenos, in turn, shouted to the Marquis that he should be the one who would risk his life for the prince. He did not understand how the Marquis could act alone. The Marquis froze in surprise, as he did not expect to hear anything like that. Galenos immediately shouted at the emperor to take his life first. But at the same time, the young lady croaked. Galenos, looking at the lady, declared that the emperor should not touch her, because she was very dear to the prince. Kamut, in turn, looked at his comrades with sadness, as they sacrificed their lives for him again and again. He understood that all this was visible to him. He was angry with himself, as he knew he should have known how cowardly and cunning his opponent could be. Buffellos mockingly stated that they wanted to call on the one whom even the elders could not meet. The prince understood that he could now turn into a human and take the full brunt of the blow. At that very moment, the emperor, smiling, asked what Myrddin would say to all this. Myrddin smiled and told the emperor that he was asking something like that even at that moment. Nadia was taken aback, as she did not expect to see something like that. She froze in shock as she saw the transformation. At this, everyone present froze in stupor. Myrddin, with a satisfied smile, transformed into her true form and declared that she had arrived by order of the emperor. She smiled and said that the struggle for power and authority is always insidious and cruel. 3. The prince was taken aback and asked his mentor what had happened, but since he had said that she would not appear at such events, Myrddin said with a smile that there was less bloodshed among the nobles in the empire thanks to this duel, but the situation did not get any better from this, and the proof of this was right in front of them. She easily used her magic, and thus the man began to float in the air, bound in chains. The emperor looked at the man closely, as he did not expect him to dare to do something like this and fool the other senior wizards. At that very moment, he turned to his son and asked him if he really thought that there had never been any heirs before him who thought the same way. The young man was taken aback and asked his father in surprise what he was talking about. At that moment, the emperor stood up and said that there were no records of the fight left, which meant there was no way to check whether the previous fights were fair or not. However, as one who had ascended to the throne through a duel, he could say one thing for sure. He looked closely at his son and stated that when he was in the duel, there was one heir who had used magic just like his son was now. But he did not object and ordered the nobles who supported him to remain silent. While using magic is an extremely cowardly act, it would be even more foolish not to resort to any means when life is at stake. Moreover, if the opponent died, it would mean that he was not worthy of the emperor's place in the first place. For this reason, he pretended that he knew nothing. The prince was shocked. At that very moment, the emperor declared that in this sense, none of them satisfied him, but he clearly lacked loyalty to his supporters. The emperor told his son that if he had not abandoned the marquis, such a loyal advisor, he would never have done something so stupid and noticeable. At that very moment, the marquis asked what would happen now if he were forced to obey such a man and remain silent. At that very moment, the marquis said that they should not live in the past and should simply close this topic. The emperor supported him. The emperor said that he did not know whether his son would have won if he had not been caught. But now that everything was hidden, he was forced to bear the punishment. The prince was shocked because he could not lose everything so easily. At that very moment, the elder used magic, but no one noticed it, and the emperor continued his speech. But at that very moment, everyone froze, as the young prince, with the help of magic, transformed himself, and at the same time, he had a very specific appearance. He shouted that if he destroyed all the members of the imperial family, he would become the next emperor. For this reason, he rushed towards his father with rage in his eyes as he wanted to deal with him. Myrddin shouted and called for the emperor, but the man said that she could not do something like that. He looked at her with a smirk and said that this fight was not declared legal, so it would be a big problem for Budit if she interfered in the sacred battle of the imperial family. The young men backed away and froze for a moment, as they realized that they could not interfere in the fight. Meanwhile, the emperor stood frozen and stared at his son, who opened his mouth in rage to strike. Kamut was in shock, as he understood that his father could suffer, but he, unfortunately, could not do anything as he was wrapped in demonic power. At that very moment, the young lady could not bear it any longer and rushed to the aid of the emperor. She dealt blow after blow to the prince with fury. The prince was furious, as he saw that everyone on all sides was interfering in the duel, and he could not deal with his father. But in turn, he was filled with anger and fury, as he understood that absolutely everyone had to be torn to pieces. Meanwhile, the young lady was in a perplexed state. After all, she did something similar, and then thought about what happened. She was worried that her future father-in-law could get hurt because he intervened unconsciously, but at the same time, she did not understand why everything suddenly went dark. Myrddin looked closely at the wizard and asked what he had done with the third prince. Buffellos laughed and said that the secrets of demonic magic were beyond the comprehension of even the head of the imperial magicians. He said that he had not done anything special. After all, he only helped a little with what the prince wanted so much. But the one who nurtured the darkness was the prince himself. At that very moment, he felt lighter and declared sadly that he had spent too much energy on the temporary body. He said with a grin that he would greet Myrddina next time, as befits her, and said that it was a great honor for him to meet her. She was shocked because she didn't expect things to turn out this way, but moments later she turned around because she heard a crow cawing. She froze when she saw the crow cawing and attacking the prince. At that very moment, she hurried to the emperor, but he declared that he was fine. At the same time, the emperor asked his old friend if she had known that his son would attack him. At the same time, he said that he was amazed at the crow's ingenuity. Myrddin sighed heavily and said that although she knew that it was not the real Buffalos, this information turned out to be useless. The emperor said with a smile that it was enough for now that she had banished the wizard. Myrddin reported that everyone was in confusion now because they were fighting demonic shadows, and this was not a very usual ally for them. She asked the emperor if they should watch a little longer. At the same time, the young people were furious. They did not understand why these shadows did not disappear along with the magician, but they assumed that they were driven by the mana that remained in the body of the third prince. Myrddin asked the emperor if he had not enjoyed the spectacle properly. The emperor smiled and stated that she knew him better than anyone. At that very moment, he said that he would like to see what his eldest son would do in this situation. He knew perfectly well that the battle was not yet over. Meanwhile, the prince felt a wild and burning pain, which prevented him from moving, and all the wounds he had received continued to bleed. He saw many unexpected things happen, and his mind became even more clouded. However, he saw his friend fighting with the wolf, but at the same time, Kamut understood that now it did not matter at all, since instead of relying on others and engaging in self-flagellation, he had to do something. Having broken the shackles that had long held him back, he rushed towards his brother. Kamut was furious and knew he had to think about those he had to protect. So he filled his brother with rage. Without wasting a single minute, he dealt him blow after blow, and in the process, he still managed to knock his brother to the ground. Raynell flew up and looked at her lover in surprise. At that moment, his charges looked at him with joy, as they were glad that he had done something like that. At that very moment, the emperor, with a satisfied smile, announced that his successor had finally been determined. Looking at everyone present, he immediately declared that the winner of this competition was Kamut, Ebel de Wulfric. The long struggle for the throne finally ended. After the duel, the senior mages, who had previously avoided interfering in political affairs, felt responsible for Bufalos's betrayal and began searching for him. Caught cheating, Llewellyn was imprisoned in the imperial prison until sentenced by Kamut. A Kamut, who had to make a decision, had not woken up for several days. Nadia looked intently at her mistress and reassured her, since the priest did everything possible to heal the prince, and even Lady Myrddin kept an eye on the prince. For this reason, he should soon wake up. After some time, Myrddin stated that the prince had indeed been subjected to a demonic curse. Galenos asked if it was serious. She stated that, fortunately, several days had already passed since the contact meant, and the sacred blood of the wolf suppressed the curse, so the curse should not cause much harm. However, she understood that if this continued, the situation would become truly dangerous, because this curse was becoming much stronger, and thus, it was intensifying the person's most passionate desires. Galeno stated that in that case, everything would be fine, because the prince was a very kind man. The Marquis said that he thought the same. He asked what was wrong with the fact that good desires would become stronger. She sighed heavily and said that it was a little unclear, she explained to them. She wondered if a world that took away all free will from a person and controlled it would be a good place to live. She said that for the slightest mistake, the owner can be mercilessly destroyed in order to maintain peace. The young people were taken aback, as they did not expect to hear something like that. The Marquis asked if she really meant that excessive kindness could turn into a disaster. She said that it was so, because everything should be within the limits of reasonable norms. This is why people could not live in the underworld, where absolute evil reigns, or in the kingdom of heaven, filled only with goodness. Galenos Yu decided and shouted that they must immediately get rid of the curse. The Marquis sighed heavily and stated that if the lady could do this, she would not have chewed everything out for them. Myrddin sighed and stated that Buffalos was the only person in the Empire who studied demonic magic, so it was very difficult to get rid of the curse right now. At that very moment, the Marquis declared that sacred wolf blood flowed in his veins and that he himself had chosen the path of magic. At that very moment, he asked if he could help her with anything. She was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing, but at the same moment, she said with a smile that he could help her. Sometime later, the young people watched everything that was happening, as they knew that the process was taking a long time. Galeno said that she should not come closer, since the curse affects a person's desire. Therefore, at the time of its removal, no one should be nearby. Raynell looked at the prince with sadness, but she understood that it would be good if he woke up as soon as possible. She really wanted to see him. After some time, the madam announced with a smile that they were finished, and the curse was completely lifted. At that very moment, the young people beamed with joy and happiness. Nadia asked with a smile if they could now enter the room. Madame smiled and stated that of course they could do so. Nadia told her mistress with a smile that they needed to hurry. At that moment, the knight was taken aback, as he did not know where to run. At that moment, he asked the Marquis where he was going. The Marquis smiled and said that he had spent too much energy and was tired, so he should go and rest a little. After some time, the prince finally came to his senses. When he opened his eyes, he was puzzled, as he did not remember what had happened. He remembered that before he lost consciousness, his lover attacked his brother. For this reason, he quickly jumped out of bed and called her. He wanted to know what had happened to her and whether she was hurt. But a moment later, he saw her and felt relieved because she was lying next to him in bed and sleeping peacefully. For some time, Kamut looked at his friend in a daze, as if enchanted. At that very moment, he sighed heavily as he realized that she was okay. He was glad to know this, and at that moment, he touched her tenderly. A moment later, the young man entered the room, as he saw that the prince had woken up. He quickly asked the prince if he was in any pain. Kamut sighed heavily and said that he was fine and there were no problems, only that he had a headache, and most likely it was because he had slept for a long time. Galenos, in turn, without wasting a minute, began to tell the prince about what had happened. But before he could finish speaking, her ice took on the appearance of a human. She couldn't contain her rage and shouted that he was just an idiot. Kamut froze for a moment in surprise because he was hit for no apparent reason. She was furious and screamed that he was very badly hurt. She did not understand how he even had the strength to attack his brother in the end. She continued to scream and hit the prince. At the same time, the young man asked Nadia what they should do in such a situation. Nadia stated that they should not interfere in the lovers' quarrel. For this reason, they made a strategic retreat and ran after the magicians. Raynel, in turn, continued to shout at the prince, as he promised her that he would not die. She understood perfectly well that she had imagined all this, and she knew that in such a terrible situation, the prince's decision was the best. She was beautiful. She understood everything. But she was very tired during those few days that she spent next to him, and he never regained consciousness. She was angry with the prince because of her own inability to help him and because of his recklessness. At that very moment, the prince was taken aback and asked her for forgiveness because it was all his fault. But at that very moment, she shouted at him not to move, since he had not even recovered. Kamut looked at his beloved with a contented and tender smile and again asked for forgiveness. He gently wiped away her tears, while constantly apologizing for making her worry. Kamut, looking into her eyes, said that she could be angry with him as much as she wanted, but if she did not want to forgive him, then he would accept it. He said that he would wait until she calmed down. It seemed to her that because she had never loved anyone so much, she could not take control of her feelings and stop being impulsive in words and actions when it came to the prince. At that very moment, she asked for forgiveness for getting angry at him for no reason. He smiled and said that she didn't have to apologize. Raynel, in turn, felt ashamed of her actions, as she had acted like a picky child, while she sat and cried in front of the bullied man. A few minutes later, the prince was informed that guests had arrived. At this point, the young lady quickly transformed into her animal form. They entered the prince's room, and Mirthan was interested in the prince's well-being. She wanted to know if there were any strange sensations. He smiled and stated that he was still a little sleepy, but otherwise everything was fine. Myrddin looked at him with a smile and said that he did not need to address the frost so formally. The prince said that, although he had often heard about her from his father, for this reason, he could not show disrespect to the emperor's tutor. Raynel, in turn, froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear anything like that. Myrddin said with a smile that such speeches embarrassed her. Raynel was surprised and shocked because she had just learned that her grandmother was not only the head of the imperial magicians, but she was also the emperor's mentor. At that very moment, Myrddin looked at the prince's crow with a smile. She reported that during the duel with the raven, she noticed that the prince had resorted to forbidden magic. Myrddin said that the crow had protected the emperor from attack, and even now she understood perfectly well what they were all talking about. Myrddin noticed with a smile that the crow in front of them was unusual. She looked closely at the beautiful bird and asked whether she was right or not. At the same time, the young lady was shocked and did not know what to do. In this situation, she wondered if she had really been exposed like that. The prince, in turn, looked at Madame with bewilderment, not knowing what to answer. At that very moment, he sighed heavily and said with a smile that it was difficult to hide something from the lady. She smiled and said that since he would be the next emperor, he had no reason to hide anything from her. He smiled and stated that this was indeed the case. At that very moment, he leaned against his girlfriend and asked what she thought about it. He asked if she would show her transformation. He also said that there was no one who could threaten her now, so he thought that there was no need for her to be in beast form all the time. Raynell knew perfectly well that his words were true, for he was the winner of the competition, and now all the threats were behind her, so she realized that she no longer needed to hide. The Marquis, in turn, stood frozen in a daze. When he saw that the crow had turned into a man, he was stunned, as he realized that she was not just a smart bird. Galeno said with a smile that this appearance amazed him every time. Nadia smiled because she completely agreed with him. Mirden told the prince with a smile that he had met a very unusual creature. She stated that the crow that ate the Krobenrock was indeed rare to meet on the road. The prince was surprised because she understood even this, but he did not understand how she managed to understand something like that. Madame, with a smile, stated that she had once studied Krobenrock in her distant youth, and for this reason, she too was lucky enough to meet a similar bird. She was very surprised when she saw something like this on her difficult path. Then she saw a crow that was able to turn into a human. Raynell, in turn, was shocked by what she heard, but at the same moment, she asked if the crow was alive. At the same time, she apologized for interrupting Madame suddenly, but she really wanted to know this. The madam said with a smile that it was all right. Since young ladies did not need to observe human etiquette, Raynell Wu changed her mind and said that even crows had a kind of respect for their elders. Raynell asked the lady if the crow was still alive, since she had met her when she was young, so she assumed that the crow might have already died. She knew very well that the lifespan of crows is 10 or 15 years. But there are some species that live more than 20 years, but this is still much less than the average human lifespan. Raynell looked at the prince and said that he did not need to move as he had not yet recovered. He was taken aback and stated that he needed to hear the answer to her questions. Mirden said with a smile that before answering, she would like to know something from them. She looked closely at everyone present and asked the young lady what if it turned out that her life would be as short as that of ordinary crows. She asked the girl what if she had to go on a long journey much earlier than everyone else in the room. She wanted to know what the young lady would do in this situation. Raynell thought for a moment, but after a few minutes she said that in that case, every moment was precious, and she wanted to do everything she could for the people around her and not waste time. She smiled and stated that this way she would not regret her life later. The prince froze in place, as he did not expect her to say something like that. At that very moment, the young ice joyfully declared that, of course, she would find a way to live longer, since she knew that nothing was impossible in the world of magic. Raynell looked intently at her lover and stated that she was sure that there was some solution. The prince said with a smile that he would find a way, even if it meant raising the ears of all the inhabitants of the empire. The lady looked at the young people with a satisfied smile, as she saw that they were very positive. But she said there was no need to disturb the inhabitants of the empire, since the crow was still alive. Some time ago, Hampel apologized to her friend, as she wanted to meet the crow she spoke of, but unfortunately, she was not in the best shape. Mirden smiled and told her friend that they could meet next time, but now she could have a good rest until her return. Mirden Ulibkoy said that her friend was probably still fast asleep in her residence. Mirden said more research was still needed, but she believed the crows that ate the fruit had a lifespan similar to humans. So, looking at the young people, she said with a smile that they should not worry about the young lady meeting an early death. Raynell, with tears in her eyes, thanked the madam for the valuable information. Madame said with a smile that she understood their feelings perfectly, since at one time she too had been very worried about this. She was glad that her friend was by her side all this time, so not wanting to part with such a beautiful creature too early, she immersed herself in the study of the Krobenrock and the crows. That is why she had a personal interest in the prince's crow, because since such cases were rare, she was very limited in the materials for her research. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if she would mind if she asked for cooperation. Raynell Minutu agreed with her, as she too had a lot of questions about herself, so she intended to help in any way she could. At that very moment, the prince approached Madame and declared that since the conversation had turned to mutual assistance, he would like to set one condition. At that very moment, he showed everyone a beautiful necklace. Galeno stated that before the young mistress was kidnapped, she always wore this necklace. Kamut, in turn, asked the madam to repair the necklace and cast a stronger spell on it so that it could protect his beloved. Ray now looked closely at the prince, as she realized that he was still very worried about her because of the recent incident. At that moment, Madame accepted the necklace and realized that the Marquis had cast a spell on it. She stated that it would be easier to add new spells, so she decided not to limit herself to magic. The Marquis looked at Madame in surprise, but she only smiled. At that very moment, she stated that there was an option for Miss Defense to make a spiritual contract with the help of this thing. They looked at her in surprise, as they did not expect to hear such a thing. Madame said that a crow is a creature that flies high in the sky, so the spirit of the wind would suit her best. The Marquis immediately looked at Madame and asked if mana, or spiritual compatibility, was not needed to control a spirit. He said that the young lady could be an exception because of the fetus, but still, up until this point, only humans could enter into such a contract, and they did not know what the consequences would be, so it was necessary to be more careful in this matter. Madame said with a smile that she was beautiful. She understood him, but she assured him that there was no need to worry about it. She said that wild animals live freely and cannot change their environment as much as people can, so their connection with spirits was very strong. And since Miss Crow could turn into a human, she wouldn't have any problems with the deficiency. She also knew very well that there was one little-known fact about Rock. They all knew that it was known as a mysterious fruit that granted the human who ate it various abilities upon awakening. However, no one has ever seen it growing on any particular tree, and most often they are found in random and completely different places across the continent. She said that based on this information, they could claim that it was not a fetus at all. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked what he was then. She said that the founder of the imperial family was a sacred wolf. And there is something that not everyone knew, because the closest animal to the sacred wolf was a black bird. And they said that this sacred black bird left fragments of its eggshells in different corners of the earth for the descendants of the crows. This meant that the Rock was originally created for crows, and its potential is many times greater if it is eaten by a raven and not a human. Mirden drew a magic circle. She said that although the spiritual contract required compliance with several difficult points, she could skip a few of them, and they needed to create conditions as close to natural as possible. She looked at everyone present and stated that this required more concentration on this matter. She wanted them to be left alone. At that very moment, they stated that they would do their best. Mir then asked the Marquis if he could tidy up the flow of magic in the circle. He asked if everything would be okay if he did something like that. He was worried that something might go wrong, but she assured him that there would be no problems as long as he didn't use super powerful magic. She looked at him with a smile and said that she would guide the Lady Crow, so he should help her. He smiled and agreed with her. Kamut came closer to his beloved and asked if everything was okay. After all, he saw that she looked very nervous. She was taken aback and said that everything was fine, but trembling with fear, she said that she was a little excited. She didn't understand what kind of contract with the spirit they were talking about, but at the same time, she realized the seriousness of this situation. But she also knew that she might develop abilities that would protect her in the future. The madam looked closely at the girl and declared that now she would be able to look into the spirit world only for a short time. She said that it might confuse her, but she had to try and concentrate. In order to find the right spirit, after a few seconds, she plunged into the spirit world. The young lady looked around the beautiful world with admiration, as she could not believe that there were so many spirits around. At the same time, she understood that one of the children would become her spirit. The madam, smiling, declared that when she found a suitable spirit, she should call him by name. She said that the girl should name the first name that comes to her mind. At that very moment, she saw a beautiful spirit, and without wasting a single minute, she called him by name. At that very moment, she asked if he would become her spirit. A moment later, the young lady received consent from her new spirit. Murden, in turn, saw the young lady awaken after making a contract with the spirit, and she was a little surprised. She looked at the girl for a while, as she did not expect this. Raynell looked at herself as she saw that her clothes had changed again, At the same time, she was too focused on her experiences and did not attach much importance to it. But it seemed to her that her clothes were changing along with her feelings. Raynell looked at her spirit with a smile and asked him if he thought her judgments were correct, but unfortunately, she did not hear the answer, since her spirit was also not in the know. Raynell looked at her new friend with a smile and said that he didn't need to apologize, but at the same time, she was struck by his beauty and sweetness. She said that they would slowly figure this out. The lady said with a smile that they would find out about everything, since they would meet often in the future. At that very moment, the prince approached his beloved and said that she needed to approach this issue without fanaticism. Otherwise, he could spend less time with her. He smiled and asked his beloved if his words were true. She looked away from him with a smile, as she was very embarrassed. At that moment, Raynell asked her spirit if he also thought that such a face was simply against the rules. The prince smiled and said that she was already used to it and should stop being so embarrassed. She was embarrassed, but at the same time, she understood that she would definitely have to get used to this, because now she felt safe. And at the same time, she understood that she could spend more time with her lover. Sometime later, the prince visited his brother, who had suffered greatly under the influence of black magic. Madame stated that he had been near her Bolshevik and had been exposed to demonic magic. She also contributed to the acceleration of the changes. So, the golden shade of the hair, which was considered the property of the imperial family, changed. She told the prince that if he was left in this state, he would not last long. Madame said that the emperor ordered the prince to decide his fate. The prince knew he couldn't deal with him right now, but he still had a lot to learn about his brother. At the same time, he was puzzled and did not know what to do in this situation. Kamut immediately asked if his brother could be saved. Llewellyn angrily asked his brother how long he was going to be so hypocritical. He asked his brother if he really thought that such words would touch him and that he would suddenly take the path of truth. He shouted to his brother that such a thing would not happen. He shouted with a predatory grin that he didn't regret at all that he lived exactly like that. And if he regretted anything, it was that he couldn't kill his brother in a duel. Llewellyn shouted furiously at his brother that he could have tried to save him. Llewellyn looked at his brother with a grin and declared that he would then do everything possible to ensure that he suffered well before his death. Kamut sighed heavily and told Madame that she had previously asked him about his plans for his brother. He wondered if there was a way to save the prince. Kamut looked intently at the madam and said that if his brother was truly doomed, she would not have asked him about his plans for the prince. The madam sighed heavily and said with a smile that he was very perceptive. She stated that the prince had been exposed to magic for a long time and that its effects could not be gotten rid of so easily. However, she said that the prince could extend his brother's life if he used the collar. She reported that he was holding a magical artifact that contained the power of heaven.